You know what's funny? Everybody gets this quote wrong. Life is short. You've heard it 1,000 times. Graduation speeches, greeting cards, some influencer on the internet staring into a ring light telling you to hustle because the clock is ticking. Life is short. Seize the day. You're running out of time. But here's the thing. The greatest human beings who ever lived, the ones who did something with their time on this earth, when they got to the end, when they were lying there taking those last few breaths, looking back on everything, they didn't say life was short. They said the opposite. They said you have too much time, but you're wasting too much of it. Not in a cruel way, not as an accusation, more like a quiet correction from someone who finally understood it all at the end. See, a short life with purpose feels like an eternity, and a long life without it? That feels like an afternoon nap you can't wake up from. Tonight, I want to share with you the deathbed wisdom of 12 of the most remarkable human beings in human history. 12 people who, through suffering, through courage, through sheer stubborn refusal to look away from the truth, figured out something about being alive that most of us spend our whole lives missing. Some of them died old. Some of them died impossibly young. One of them drank poison on purpose and thanked the man who handed him the cup. Another walked out into a blizzard and never came back. And the last thing he said was so understated, so perfectly British, that it became the most famous exit line in history. None of them wasted their time, not a single one. And the advice they left behind, it's not complicated, it's not some secret code. It's 12 simple rules, 12 ways of seeing your life that once you actually let them sink in, will make tomorrow morning feel very different from every morning that came before it. Welcome, nightlings. This is Huxley. If you like listening or falling asleep to real stories that will reveal life's deeper truths, then this is the place for you. Whether you're drifting off to sleep, driving through the dark, or just sitting somewhere quiet with your thoughts tonight, I'm glad you're here. Truly, this is one of those episodes I've been thinking about for a long time, and it feels right to finally share it with you. If you have been enjoying these episodes, do me a quick favor and share your favorite episode with a friend who will enjoy it. This will help more than you know. All right, let's begin. Rule 1. Know when to walk into the storm. The greatest understatement in the English language was spoken inside a tent at 40 degrees below zero. It was March 17th, 1912. A man with gangrene in both feet, frostbite crawling up his hands, and a body that had been slowly dying for weeks, unzipped his sleeping bag, looked at the 3 men he'd been suffering beside and said, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." Then he walked into a blizzard and was never seen again. His name was Lawrence Edward Grace Oates, Captain Oates. Titus, his friends called him, after a Roman, which is ironic because what he did that morning was more Roman than anything an actual Roman ever managed. But we'll get to that. First, I need to tell you who this man was before the ice, because you can't understand the death without understanding the life that led to it. Oates was born in 1880 to a wealthy English family. Country estates, private schools, the whole comfortable package. He could have done nothing with his life, and no one would have blinked. Plenty of men in his position did exactly that. But Oates had a stubborn streak in him, a contrarian quality, the kind of man who, when told something couldn't be done, didn't argue about it. He just went and did it while everyone else was still talking. He joined the army, the 6th Inniskilling Dragoons. And in 1901, during the Boer War in South Africa, he showed the world exactly what kind of person he was. His unit was pinned down, taking heavy fire. The sensible thing, the rational thing, was to surrender. Some of the men wanted to, and Oates, 20 years old, barely shaving, probably terrified, said something that sounds like it was written by a screenwriter, but was actually just him. He said, "We came to fight, not to surrender." They fought. And Oates was shot. The bullet shattered his left thigh bone. He refused to be left behind, was dragged to safety, and spent months recovering. His leg was never quite right again. It was an inch shorter than the other one for the rest of his life. He limped. It hurt. He never complained about it. Well, almost never. He was British, so he complained in the specific British way that sounds like not complaining, but absolutely is. Now, fast forward 10 years, Robert Falcon. Scott is putting together an expedition to be the first to reach the South Pole. This was the space race of its era. Nations were competing, reputations were at stake, and the whole world was watching. Scott needed men who were tough, experienced, and, this part is important, willing to pay their own way. These expeditions were expensive, and the funding was never quite enough. Oates had money, Oates had toughness, and Oates had a particular expertise that Scott needed. He knew horses. The expedition planned to use Manchurian ponies to haul supplies across the Antarctic ice shelf, and they needed someone who could manage the animals. So, Oates signed on. He put up £1,000 of his own money, a fortune in 1910, and joined the Terra Nova expedition. And almost immediately, he started having opinions. See, here's the thing about Oates that makes this story richer than the legend. He wasn't some wide-eyed adventurer swept up in the romance of exploration. He was a realist. When he saw the ponies that had been selected for the expedition, he was appalled. He called them. And I love this because it's so perfectly Oates, a wretched load of crocks. He thought they were too old, too weak, and badly chosen. He was right. Most of them would die on the ice. He also had reservations about Scott himself. He kept a diary. Fragments of it survive, and his private assessments of the expedition's leadership were, let's say, unsparing. He thought some of the decisions were reckless. He thought the planning had gaps. He said things in that diary that, had Scott read them, would have ended the friendship on the spot. But Oates didn't quit. He didn't go home. He didn't even argue publicly. He saddled up the crocs, managed them as best he could, and marched south with the rest of them. Because that's who he was. You do the job. You don't whine about it. Even when the job is slowly killing you. The Polar Party, the group selected for the final push to the pole, was 5 men. Scott, Oates, Edward Wilson, Henry Bowers, and Edgar Evans. 5 men, hauling sledges across the most hostile landscape on Earth, toward a goal that had consumed Scott's career and imagination for years. They reached the South Pole on January 17th, 1912. And there, sticking out of the ice, was a Norwegian flag. Roald Amundsen had beaten them by 35 days. I want you to imagine that moment. You've walked 800 miles. You're exhausted, frostbitten, malnourished, and operating at the edge of human endurance. You've sacrificed everything for this. And when you finally arrive, someone else's flag is already there, fluttering in the wind, like it's been waiting to make a point. Scott wrote in his diary that it was a terrible disappointment. That's British understatement again. Oates didn't record his reaction, but it's not hard to guess. He was a man who'd known from the start that the planning was flawed. A man who'd watched the ponies die one by one and said nothing. A man who'd come anyway. And now they had to walk back. The return journey was when everything fell apart. The weather turned savage, even by Antarctic standards. Temperatures dropped to levels that shouldn't exist outside of scientific notation. The food depots they'd laid on the outward journey were spaced too far apart. Edgar Evans, the strongest man in the party, deteriorated rapidly. A fall on the ice had injured his head, and he died on February 17th. And Oates was getting worse. His old war wound, that Boer War bullet, that shattered thigh bone, that leg that was never quite right, became his death sentence in the cold. Frostbite set in, then gangrene. His feet swelled until he could barely force them into his boots each morning. Every step was agony. Every mile took longer than the last. He knew what he was. He was the slowest man in the party. He was holding them back. And in the Antarctic, being held back doesn't mean arriving late. It means dying. He asked Wilson, the doctor, his friend, whether he had any chance. Wilson, because he was kind, or because he was a liar, or because he was both, said he didn't know. But everyone in that tent knew. Oates knew. He asked them to leave him. They wouldn't. Scott wouldn't allow it. Whether that was out of honor or stubbornness or some combination that the English have never been able to untangle, they wouldn't leave him behind. So, on the morning of March 17th, his 32nd birthday, which is the kind of detail that makes you wonder if God has a novelist's instinct for symbolism, Captain Lawrence Oates woke up in that tent and made a decision. He didn't make a speech. He didn't write a farewell letter. He didn't cry. He simply said those words, those perfect, devastating, impossibly restrained words. I am just going outside and maybe some time. And he walked into the storm. They never found his body. Now, here's the part of this story that most people don't tell you, and it's the part that keeps me up at night if I think about it too long. His sacrifice didn't work. It didn't save them. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers made it 11 more miles. 11 miles! Before they were trapped by a blizzard. They died in their tent, frozen, just 11 miles from a supply depot that would have saved their lives. 11 miles. You could walk that in an afternoon. On a good day, you could almost see it from where they died. And here's the detail that makes it even more cruel. That supply depot, 1-ton depot, they called it, was supposed to have been placed 30 miles further south. Scott's plan had called for it. But during the depot-laying journey, the dog teams had struggled, and the decision was made to leave it 30 miles short of the planned location. 30 miles. A decision made months earlier, in different weather, under different pressure, by men who couldn't have known. And it cost 4 lives. There's one more thing. Oates' mother. She lived for decades after his death, and she never forgave Scott. Never. She believed her son had died because of poor leadership, bad planning, and the kind of British hubris that mistakes ambition for competence. She refused to attend memorials. She rejected the narrative of noble sacrifice. She wanted people to know that her son's death was, at least in part, preventable. And she wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't entirely right. Because here's what Oates did that morning. He chose, just like Frankl chose. The circumstances were different, grotesquely different, but the core act was the same. He looked at his situation, he assessed what was being asked of him, and he chose his own way. He couldn't control the weather. He couldn't control the frostbite, or the gangrene, or the 30 miles that 1-ton depot was out of place. He couldn't fix Scott's planning or undo the Boer War bullet. All he could control was how he met the end. And he met it with such quiet, absolute grace that a century later we're still talking about it. That's rule 1, nightlings. Know when to walk into the storm. Sometimes courage isn't about winning. It isn't about survival. It isn't about the story ending well. Sometimes courage is about recognizing that you've become the problem, that your presence, your weakness, your need is pulling others down, and having the honesty, the brutal honesty, to act on that recognition. I'm not saying you should sacrifice yourself for your co-workers. Please don't walk into any blizzards on my account. But I am saying this. There are storms in every life. Moments where the right thing to do is the hard thing to do. Conversations you've been avoiding. Jobs you should leave. Relationships that are dragging both of you under the ice. And when that moment comes, you won't get a soundtrack. Nobody will write a poem about it. It'll just be you, in your own tent, at your own 40 below, deciding what kind of person you are. Oates. And I think this is the funniest part of the whole story, in the way that only deeply sad things can be funny. Oates privately couldn't stand Scott. His diary makes that pretty clear. He thought Scott was impulsive, emotional, and not nearly as competent as he believed himself to be. And yet, when the moment came, Oates died for him. Died for all of them. Died for men he'd been quietly criticizing in his journal for months. Because, in the end, what he thought about them didn't matter. What mattered was who he was. All right, let's come inside now. Let's get warm. Our next story takes us from the Antarctic ice to a hidden annex in Amsterdam, from a 32-year-old soldier to a 15-year-old girl, and from the greatest understatement in the English language to perhaps the most extraordinary statement of faith ever written. Rule 2. Believe in people anyway. She was 15 years old. Freedom was 3 weeks away. And she never made it. That's the fact of it, the bare, unbearable fact. Anne Frank died in February or March of 1945. We don't know the exact date, because by then nobody was counting anymore. At Bergen-Belsen concentration camp of typhus, in conditions so horrific that even the survivors struggled to describe them. The British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen on April the 15th. She missed it by weeks, maybe days. 15 years old. I've been telling stories for a long time now, nightlings, and this one never gets easier. Not because of the horror, though the horror is real, but because of what she left behind. What she believed, what she chose to believe, in a world that gave her every reason to believe the opposite. But let me start at the beginning, or close to it. Anneliese Marie Frank was born in Frankfurt, Germany, in 1929. Her father, Otto, was a businessman. Her mother, Edith, was quiet and devout. Her sister, Margot, 3 years older, was the studious one, the well-behaved one, the one who did what she was told. Anne was not that. Anne was talkative, opinionated, loud by her own cheerful admission. She had a gift for observation and an even greater gift for saying exactly what she observed, whether or not anyone wanted to hear it. She was, in other words, a perfectly normal girl. A bit more articulate than most, maybe. A bit more alive to the absurdities of the world around her. But normal. That's important to remember, because the story that follows is so extraordinary that it's easy to forget. This was a kid. A kid who liked movie stars and boys and writing stories and driving her mother absolutely crazy. When the Franks moved to Amsterdam in 1933, fleeing the rising Nazi tide in Germany, they thought they were safe. The Netherlands was neutral. It had been neutral in the First World War. It would be fine. It would be fine. It was not fine. The Germans invaded in May 1940, and within 2 years the walls had closed in completely. Jews were required to wear yellow stars. Jews couldn't ride streetcars. Jews couldn't go to the cinema, or swim in public pools, or sit in their own gardens after 8 in the evening. Layer by layer, restriction by restriction, everything that made a life recognizably human was peeled away. And then, in July 1942, Margot received a call-up notice. A deportation order. She was 16. Otto Frank had been preparing for this. For months he'd been quietly building a hiding place, the secret Annex they'd call it later, behind his business at 263 Prinsengracht. A few rooms hidden behind a bookcase in the upper floors of the building. It was cramped, it was dark, and for 761 days it was home. 761 days. 2 years and 30 days. Think about that. Think about your last 2 years. The places you went, the people you saw, the air you breathed. And now, imagine all of it reduced to a few rooms. No going outside, no opening the windows wide enough to be seen, no running, no shouting, no flushing the toilet during business hours because the workers downstairs might hear. No being a normal kid on a normal street in a normal city. And into this silence, this impossibly small world, Anne Frank poured everything she had. The diary was a birthday present. a red and white checkered autograph book given to her on her 13th birthday, June the 12th, 1942, 3 weeks before they went into hiding. She addressed her entries to Kitty, an imaginary friend, because, and this tells you something about Anne's loneliness and her intelligence in equal measure, she wanted to write to someone who would listen, who wouldn't interrupt, who wouldn't tell her she was wrong or too loud or too much. And what she wrote, look, I know the diary is famous. I know it's been translated into 70, no, more than 70 languages and read by tens of millions of people. But if you haven't read it since school, if you've let it become a symbol instead of a book, I want to tell you, go back to it. Because what Anne Frank wrote in that annex isn't what you remember. It's not just the testimony of a victim. It's the work of a writer. A real one. Funny, sharp, self-aware, sometimes cruel in the way that adolescents are cruel, and then suddenly so wise it takes your breath away. She wrote about the fights with her mother. She wrote about her crush on Peter Van Pels, the teenage boy hiding with his family in the annex alongside the Franks. She wrote about boredom. God, the boredom of hiding. The way time becomes an enemy when you have nothing to fill it with. She wrote about fear. She wrote about hope. She wrote about who she was and who she wanted to become. And she did it with a voice so vivid that when you read her, you forget, just for a moment, how the story ends. And then you remember, and it hits you all over again. On August 4th, 1944, the secret annex was raided. Someone had betrayed them. Who exactly has been debated for decades, and we may never know for certain. The Gestapo came. All 8 people in hiding were arrested. They were sent first to Westerbork, a transit camp in the northern Netherlands, and then, on September 3rd, on the very last transport, to ever leave Westerbork, to Auschwitz. The last transport. If the betrayal had come 3 weeks later, the camp would have been liberated. 3 weeks. It's the kind of timing that makes you want to argue with the universe. At Auschwitz, the men were separated from the women. Otto Frank would never see his wife or daughters again, though he didn't know that yet. Edith Frank died at Auschwitz in January 1945, of starvation and exhaustion. Margot and Anne were transferred to Bergen-Belsen in late October 1944. Bergen-Belsen was... I need to be careful here because words feel inadequate. It was originally designed as a prisoner of war camp. By late 1944, it had become a dumping ground, overcrowded beyond any conceivable limit, with no sanitation, almost no food, and typhus spreading like fire through straw. Prisoners slept on the ground. The dead were not buried, but piled in mounds. It was, by every measure, hell on earth. And there, in that hell, we have one of the most heartbreaking scenes in this entire story. Anne's childhood friend, Hannah Goslar, Hanneli, Anne had called her, was in a different section of the camp. They found each other. Hanneli stood on one side of a fence stuffed with straw so you couldn't see through it. And Anne stood on the other side, and they talked. Hanneli would later describe what she heard. Anne was crying. She said she had no one left. She believed both her parents were dead. She was wrong about her father. Otto survived, but she didn't know that. She was cold. She had no clothes. She'd thrown hers away because they were infested with lice. She was, as Hannely described, a broken girl. A girl who had lost everything, including the ferocious, beautiful optimism that had powered her through 2 years of hiding. Hannely threw a package over the fence. Some food, some socks. Another prisoner grabbed it before Anne could get to it. She threw a second one. This time Anne caught it. That may have been the last kind thing anyone did for Anne Frank. Margot died first. Typhus. She was so weak that she fell from her bunk, and the fall, or the disease, or both, killed her. Anne died shortly after. Alone, as far as we know. The exact date is uncertain. The best guess is late February or early March 1945. She was 15 years old. Liberation was weeks away. Now, here is where this story becomes something more than tragedy. Here is where Anne Frank reaches across 80 years of history and grabs you by the collar and says, "Listen." After the war, after the liberation, after the camps were opened and the world saw what had been done, Miep Gies, one of the Dutch women who had helped hide the Frank family, went back to the Annex. She had been there during the raid. She'd seen the Gestapo tear through the rooms, and after they left, after they took the families away, Miep found the diary. Scattered on the floor, pages everywhere, the red and white checkered book, and the loose sheets Anne had continued writing on when the book was full. Miep gathered them up. She put them in a drawer. She didn't read them. She kept them for Anne, because she believed, or hoped, or prayed, that Anne would come back for them. Anne didn't come back. When Otto Frank returned, the only member of the family to survive, Miep handed him the papers. "Here," she said, "is your daughter's legacy." Otto read them. This man who had lost his wife, both his daughters, and nearly his own life, sat down and read the words of his child. Her thoughts, her jokes, her fears, her arguments with her mother, her crush on Peter, her dreams of becoming a writer, all of it, preserved by accident and by grace in a drawer in Amsterdam, while the girl who wrote them lay in an unmarked grave at Bergen-Belsen. He published the diary in 1947. He lived until 1980, spending the rest of his life answering letters from readers, visiting schools, telling people about his daughter. He never fully recovered. How could he? But he said near the end that the diary had given him a reason to go on, that sharing Anne's words with the world was the meaning he'd found in the meaninglessness. And now we arrive at the line. You know the line. Everyone knows the line. But I want you to hear it fresh tonight, stripped of all the posters and the quotation calendars and the graduation speeches. I want you to hear it as what it actually is. The most radical, most courageous, most defiant statement of faith ever committed to paper by a child. She wrote, "I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are really good at heart." In spite of everything. She didn't write that from a place of comfort. She didn't write it because things were getting better. She wrote it from a hidden room in an occupied city, knowing that the people outside were hunting her, knowing that the world had decided she didn't deserve to be alive. And she chose, just like Frankl chose, just like Oates chose, to believe anyway. That's not naivete. Don't you dare call it naivete. A naive person believes because they haven't seen the evidence. Anne Frank believed despite the evidence. She stared into the worst of humanity and said, "No, this is not the whole truth. There is more to us than this." That takes more courage than walking into a blizzard. That takes more strength than surviving a death march. That, the act of maintaining faith in human goodness when human goodness has been nowhere in evidence, is perhaps the bravest thing a person can do. That's rule 2, nightlings. Believe in people anyway. Not because the evidence supports it. Sometimes it won't. Not because it's logical. It often isn't. But because the choice to believe, to extend grace, to assume goodness, to refuse cynicism, is itself an act of creation. It makes the world it describes. When you believe people are good, you give them permission to be. When you believe they're not, well, we've seen where that leads. And here's the thing about hope. About real Anne Frank-style hope. It isn't passive. It isn't sitting around waiting for things to improve. It's a decision, a daily one. You wake up and the news is terrible and the world is on fire and someone on the internet is being awful about something you care about. And you choose, again, today, to believe anyway. I think that's what she'd want us to remember. Not the attic, not the arrest, not the camp, but the choice. The stubborn, beautiful, impossible choice to see light where there was only darkness. 15 years old, and she understood something that most of us spend our entire lives trying to learn. Rule 3. Choose your own meaning. What happens when everything is taken from you? Not most things. Not the things you can afford to lose. The job you didn't like anyway. The apartment that was too small. The relationship that was already ending. I mean everything. Your career, your home, your family, your name, the manuscript you spent years writing, the one sewn into the lining of your coat because you believed it might one day help people. Taken. The coat itself, taken. Your hair, your dignity, your sense that the world operates on some kind of logic. Taken, taken, taken. What's left? That's not a rhetorical question. Viktor Frankl answered it, and his answer became one of the most important ideas of the 20th century. But let's start before the horror. Let's start when things were good. Vienna, the 1930s. If you were a young psychiatrist in Vienna in the 1930s, you were standing at the center of the intellectual universe. This was Freud's city. The cafes were full of people arguing about the unconscious mind over coffee, so strong it could wake the dead, which, given the topics of conversation, was occasionally necessary. Frankl was brilliant. Everyone knew it. He'd been corresponding with Freud since he was a teenager. 16 years old, sending papers to Sigmund Freud, and Freud was writing back. Think about that for a second. That's like a high school kid emailing Einstein and getting a reply that says, "Good point," Tell me more. By his early 30s, Frankl had developed his own school of thought. He called it logotherapy, from the Greek logos, meaning purpose or meaning. While Freud argued that humans are driven by pleasure, and Adler said we're driven by power, Frankl believed something different. He thought the deepest human drive, the one underneath all the others, is the search for meaning, not happiness, meaning. It was a nice theory, a comfortable theory, the kind of thing you can develop in a warm office with good lighting and patients who pay on time. And then 1941 arrived, and the theory was about to be tested in ways no laboratory could ever replicate. See, Frankl had a chance to leave. He'd secured a visa to the United States. A visa! Do you understand what that meant in 1941? That was a golden ticket. That was the difference between life and almost certain death. And he knew it. He wasn't naive about what was coming. He'd already been forced out of his hospital position. Jewish doctors were being stripped of their right to practice. The walls were closing in, and he had a door. But his parents didn't have visas. His elderly mother and father, they were staying. And Frankl went home and looked at a piece of marble his father had salvaged from a synagogue the Nazis had burned. It was a fragment of the 10 Commandments. Just one commandment was still legible on the stone. His father told him which one. "Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land." Frankl let the visa expire. Now, I need to be honest with you here. Some people hear that story and think it's beautiful. Some people hear it and think it was foolish. I've gone back and forth myself. But what I keep coming back to is this. Frankl made a choice. Not a reaction, not a surrender. A choice based on what he believed mattered most. And that choice, that specific act of choosing meaning over safety, is the seed of everything that came after. In 1942, the Frankl family was deported. Viktor, his wife Tilly, his mother, his father, his brother. They were sent to Theresienstadt first. His father died there, of starvation and pneumonia, which is the polite way of saying the camp killed him. His mother was sent to Auschwitz. She was murdered in the gas chambers. His brother Walter died at Auschwitz too, probably in the mining camps. Frankl himself was transferred to Auschwitz in October 1944. The manuscript, his life's work, the book on logotherapy sewn into his coat lining, was discovered and destroyed. He was given the clothes of a man who'd already been sent to the gas chambers. In the pocket, he found a single page torn from a Hebrew prayer book. It contained the Shema Yisrael, the most important prayer in Judaism. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." He kept that page. Now, here's what you need to understand about the camps, because Frankl wrote about this with a clarity that still cuts. The physical suffering was monstrous, yes. The starvation, the cold, the beatings, the constant nearness of death. All of that was real and terrible. But what destroyed people, what made them give up and die, wasn't the physical pain. It was the loss of meaning. Frankl watched it happen. A man who believed he'd be rescued by Christmas, when Christmas came and went, he died within days. Not from any new injury, not from any change in conditions. He died because the story he'd been telling himself collapsed, and without it, his body simply stopped. And Frankl watched the opposite too. He watched people who, by every rational measure, should have been broken, people who were thinner, sicker, weaker, somehow survive. And when he looked at what they had in common, it wasn't physical strength, it was purpose. Some of them had a child they believed was alive somewhere. Some had work they still wanted to finish. Some, and this is the part that gets me, some simply decided that their suffering meant something, that bearing witness mattered, that even here, even now, they could choose how to meet this moment. And that brings us back to the march. The pre-dawn march through the Bavarian cold. The man whispering about his wife, and Frankl retreating into himself and finding love, not as a feeling, but as a truth, as the truth. He would later write, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is close, that in that moment he grasped the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought have to offer. The salvation of man is through love and in love. He understood how a man who has nothing left can still know bliss, if only for a moment, in the contemplation of someone he loves. His wife, Tilly, was already dead by then. She died at Bergen-Belsen. He wouldn't learn this until after liberation. But here's what Frankl would tell you. If he were sitting in this room, it didn't matter. The love was real, whether she was alive or not. The meaning he drew from it was real. The choice to turn inward, to find light in total darkness, was real. And that choice, that's the whole thing. That's logotherapy in a single moment, not in a textbook, not in a lecture hall, in a frozen field at 4 a.m, surrounded by death. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Frankl survived. He was liberated in April 1945. Within 9 days, he began dictating the book that would become one of the most important works of the 20th century. He dictated it in 9 consecutive days, barely sleeping, as if the words had been building inside him for 3 years and the dam had finally broken. The book sold millions of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages. The Library of Congress named it one of the 10 most influential books in America. But here's what I love about the rest of his life, and people don't talk about this enough. Frankl didn't become some solemn, haunted figure. He got his pilot's license at 67. 67. He went mountain climbing into his 80s. He remarried, a woman named Eleanor. They were together for over 50 years, and by all accounts they were deeply happy. He taught, he lectured, he travelled, he prayed, quietly, privately, every day, though he rarely talked about it publicly. He lived to be 92 years old. And when he died, in September of 1997, he died as a man who had proven his own theory with his own life. Meaning doesn't require comfort. Purpose doesn't require good circumstances. You can find it. You can choose it anywhere, anytime, no matter what's been taken from you. Now here's where I want to bring this home to you, Nightling. Because you're probably not in a concentration camp. God willing, you never will be. And there's a temptation to hear Frankl's story and think, well, that's extraordinary, but my problems are ordinary. My life is just life. And Frankl would push back on that, gently. He was a gentle man, mostly, but firmly. He didn't believe you needed to suffer to find meaning. He believed you needed to look for it, that the search itself is the point, that a man lying awake at 3 a.m, worrying about his job or his marriage or his health can ask himself the same question Frankl asked in Auschwitz. What is life asking of me right now? Not, what do I want from life? That's the wrong direction. What is life asking of you? Maybe it's asking you to be patient with someone who doesn't deserve it. Maybe it's asking you to finish something you started. Maybe it's asking you to sit with someone who's lonely, or forgive someone who hurt you, or simply, and this is harder than it sounds, to pay attention, to notice, to be here, fully here, in this moment that will never come again. That's the first rule from the Deathbed friends. Choose your own meaning. Don't wait for it to find you. Don't assume it'll show up when conditions improve. It won't. Conditions don't improve, and then meaning arrives. Meaning arrives, and then conditions become bearable. Viktor Frankl knew that. He proved it in the worst classroom in human history. Our next story is going to feel very different. We're moving from a young girl's quiet courage to an old man's magnificent stubbornness. From an attic in Amsterdam to a bunker in London. From someone who believed in people's goodness to someone who believed in their resilience, which, if you think about it, might be the same thing wearing a different hat. Let's talk about Winston Churchill, and the speech he never actually gave on his deathbed, but should have. Rule 4. Never surrender to the darkness. Now, I want you to picture something with me for a moment. It's January 1965. London. A grand old house at 28 Hyde Park Gate. Inside, lying in a narrow bed, is a 90-year-old man who once held the entire free world together through sheer force of personality. His cheeks are sunken, his breathing is shallow. The doctors have come and gone, and at this point they're mostly just waiting. 9 days he lingered like that. 9 days. But before those 9 days began, before the massive stroke that finally caught up with him, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill looked up at his family gathered around the dinner table, pushed back from whatever it was they'd been eating, and said his last fully conscious words, "I'm bored with it all." And honestly, that might be the most Churchill thing ever said. Here's a man who survived a POW camp, survived getting hit by a car on Fifth Avenue in New York City, of all the ridiculous ways to almost die. Survived political exile, survived 2 world wars, survived what he called his black dog. That relentless, suffocating depression that followed him around for decades like a shadow with teeth. And at the very end, his final complaint wasn't about pain, wasn't about fear, wasn't about regret. It was that he was bored. Bored. Let that land for a second. Because we're going to come back to it. But first, I need to tell you about the dog. See, most people know Churchill as this thundering, defiant wartime leader. The man with the cigar and the V for Victory sign, and the speeches that could make your spine straighten just from reading them on a page 70 years later. And that's all true. Every bit of it. But what most people don't know, what got quietly tucked away for decades because it didn't fit the hero narrative, is that Churchill spent enormous portions of his life in absolute crushing despair. He called it the black dog, not metaphorically, not poetically. He talked about it like it was a literal creature that lived in his house. "I have a black dog on my back today," he'd say to his wife Clementine, and she knew exactly what he meant. Stay away. Give him space. The dog is feeding. Now, we need to be careful here, because I'm not a doctor, and I'm certainly not going to retroactively diagnose a man who's been dead for 60 years. But his own physician, Lord Moran, wrote extensively about Churchill's depressive episodes. There were periods, sometimes lasting weeks, where Churchill couldn't get out of bed, couldn't work, couldn't see the point of anything. He'd sit in his study at Chartwell, his country estate staring at walls, and the greatest orator of the 20th century couldn't find a single word worth saying. And this is the man who saved Western civilization. Think about that. Really think about it. Because we live in an age where people believe that if you struggle with depression, if you have dark days, if sometimes the black dog comes and sits on your chest and makes it hard to breathe, then somehow you're disqualified, broken, not fit for purpose. We have this fantasy that the people who do great things are the people who feel great all the time. That confidence is a permanent state. That courage means never being afraid. Churchill would have laughed at that. Actually, no, he wouldn't have laughed. He would have poured himself a whiskey, fixed you with those pale blue eyes, and told you that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back, way back, the wilderness years. That's what historians call the 1930s for Churchill. And the name is perfect because it felt exactly like wandering through a desert with no map and no water, and everyone you meet telling you you're walking in the wrong direction. See, Churchill had seen Hitler coming. He'd been warning Parliament, warning the newspapers, warning anyone who would listen, and almost nobody would listen, that this strange little man with the Charlie Chaplin moustache was building something monstrous in Germany. Churchill could see it as clearly as you can see your own hand in front of your face. The rearmament, the rhetoric, the hunger in it. And Parliament said, "Oh, Winston, there you go again, being dramatic, being a warmonger, being difficult." They actually laughed at him. In the House of Commons, laughed. Members would groan when he stood up to speak. They'd shuffle papers, have side conversations, roll their eyes. Here was arguably the most gifted political mind in British history, trying to warn them that a catastrophe was coming. And they treated him like a cranky uncle at Christmas dinner who keeps bringing up politics. For nearly a decade this went on. 10 years, well, more like 8 or 9, I should be precise about these things, of being right about the most important geopolitical threat in modern history, and being completely, utterly, maddeningly ignored. Can you imagine what that does to a man who already has a black dog? The depression during those years was ferocious. There are letters to Clementine, where you can practically feel the weight pressing down through the paper. He questioned everything. His judgment, his career, his relevance. He was in his 60s by then, and the conventional wisdom was that he was finished, a relic. Yesterday's man. And then, September 1939. Hitler invaded Poland. And suddenly, overnight, Winston Churchill went from being the embarrassing uncle to being the only person in the room who knew what to do. Now, I could spend hours, and I mean hours, talking about Churchill during the war. The speeches alone deserve their own everything. But let me just give you one moment, one scene, because it tells you everything. It's June 1940. France has fallen. The British Army has just barely escaped Dunkirk. And let's be honest, escaped is generous. They left behind every tank, every truck, every heavy gun they had. Britain is alone, completely alone. The most powerful military machine in human history is sitting across the English Channel 21 miles away, and everyone expects an invasion within weeks. Churchill's own cabinet was divided. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was quietly pushing for a negotiated peace with Hitler, which sounds reasonable until you realize what negotiated peace actually meant in 1940, which was surrender with nicer language. And Churchill stood up in the House of Commons, the same House of Commons that had laughed at him for a decade. And he said words that still make the hair stand up on the back of my neck 80-some years later. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Never surrender. Now here's what I want you to understand. When he said those words, he wasn't feeling brave. He wasn't standing there filled with confidence and certainty and British pluck. He was terrified. He knew exactly how bad the situation was. His own military advisors were telling him the odds were essentially, the odds were terrible. Let's leave it at that. But the black dog had taught him something. All those years of fighting that internal darkness, of getting out of bed when every fibre of his being said stay down, of putting one foot in front of the other when he couldn't see the path, all of it had been training. Training. For this exact moment. Depression had taught Winston Churchill how to function in the dark. Isn't that something? The thing he hated most about himself, the affliction he would have given anything to be rid of, turned out to be the precise quality that made him capable of leading a nation through its darkest hour. Because when everyone else was panicking, Churchill was calm. Not because he didn't feel the fear, but because he'd been living with a worse fear, an internal, unrelenting chemical fear, for his entire adult life. The Blitz was terrifying, sure, but it wasn't worse than the black dog. Nothing was worse than the black dog. And this brings me to the painting. Stay with me here. I know it seems like a detour, but it isn't. Churchill started painting in 1915, during one of his lowest periods. He'd just been forced to resign over the Gallipoli disaster, which, if you don't know, was a catastrophic military campaign that he'd championed that resulted in enormous casualties. The guilt was devastating. The depression that followed was probably the worst he'd ever experienced up to that point. He was 40 years old, and he thought his life was essentially over. And then, one day, almost by accident, he wandered past his sister-in-law's painting easel, picked up a brush, and something happened. He couldn't explain it exactly. He wrote about it later. Churchill wrote about everything later. The man was incapable of having an experience without turning it into prose. And the way he described it was that painting forced his mind to focus so completely on colour and light and shadow that the black dog couldn't get a word in edgewise. It was like meditation, but productive. Like therapy, but with turpentine. Over the course of his life, Churchill painted over 500. Actually, I've seen estimates as high as 544. But let's say over 500. Canvases. Landscapes mostly. Beautiful, luminous, surprisingly good paintings of the French Riviera, of Chartwell's gardens, of Moroccan markets. He painted through both world wars, through political defeats, through personal tragedies, through bouts of depression that would have hospitalized most people. The painting didn't cure the black dog. Nothing cured the black dog. But it gave him a weapon against it. A tiny room inside his own mind where the darkness couldn't follow. And I think that's one of the most important things anyone struggling with depression needs to hear. You may not be able to kill the black dog, but you can find a room where it can't reach you. For Churchill, it was painting. For you, it might be something else entirely. But the room exists. You just have to keep looking for it. Now, let me tell you about some of the times Churchill almost died before he got to die of old age, because the list is frankly absurd. 1899. He's a 24-year-old war correspondent in South Africa during the Boer War. His armoured train gets ambushed. He's captured and thrown into a POW camp. Most people would sit tight and wait for a prisoner exchange, right? Not Churchill. He escapes, climbs over the wall in the middle of the night, jumps a freight train, hides in a coal mine for 3 days. 3 days in a coal mine, in the dark, with rats, and eventually makes it nearly 300 miles to safety in Portuguese East Africa. 24 years old, already too stubborn to stay captured. 1931, New York City. Churchill, who is British and therefore instinctively looks the wrong way when crossing the street, I say that with love, steps off a curb on Fifth Avenue and gets hit by a car going 35 miles an hour. He's dragged for a considerable distance along the pavement. Broken ribs, deep scalp wound, internal bleeding. The doctors thought he might actually die. His response? He wrote an article about the experience for a magazine. And he demanded that no charges be pressed against the driver. Said it was entirely his own fault. Which, honestly, it was. Look left, Winston. The point is, and I keep coming back to this because I think it matters, Churchill's life was a masterclass in getting knocked down and getting back up, over and over and over again. Not because he was superhuman, not because he didn't feel the blows, but because somewhere deep in his stubborn, impossible, cigar-stained soul, there was a conviction that surrender was the only real defeat. Everything else was just a temporary setback. And that brings us back to that January evening in 1965. Back to the dinner table. Back to, I'm bored with it all. On January 15th, Churchill suffered a severe stroke. The left side of his brain, which had produced some of the most extraordinary sentences in the English language, went dark. He fell into a coma from which he would never fully emerge. For 9 days, London held its breath. The BBC prepared obituaries. World leaders sent messages. Crowds gathered outside 28 Hyde Park Gate in the freezing January cold, just standing there, waiting, keeping vigil for a man most of them had never met but who had, in some profound way, kept them alive. He died on January 24th, 1965, a Sunday morning, exactly 70 years to the day after his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had died. Churchill had always had a sense of timing. The funeral was the largest state funeral in British history. Leaders from 112 countries attended. The streets of London were lined with people, standing 6, 8, 10 deep, silent in the winter cold. His coffin was carried up the Thames on a barge, and as it passed, the cranes of the London Docklands, those enormous mechanical arms that loaded and unloaded the ships that built the British Empire, dipped in salute, one by one, slowly, like old soldiers bowing their heads. I still can't talk about the cranes without getting a bit, well, you know, I'm bored with it all. You know what I think he meant? I think he meant, I have fought every fight there is to fight. I have stared down Hitler and the Black Dog and a speeding car on Fifth Avenue and a Boer prison camp and my own party and my own mind. I have done everything I came here to do, and now there's nothing left to fight. For a man who only knew how to live by fighting, peace must have been the most boring thing imaginable. So here's the rule, and it's simple. Never surrender to the darkness. Not the darkness outside, the wars, the crises, the problems of the world, and not the darkness inside, the depression, the doubt, the voice that tells you you're finished. The black dog may follow you your whole life, but you don't have to let it drive. Find your painting. Find your room. And when the world tells you to sit down and shut up, remember that a 65-year-old man nobody wanted to listen to ended up saving civilization because he simply, stubbornly, magnificently refused to stop talking. Now, speaking of stubborn, let me tell you about a man who was even more stubborn than Churchill, except he did it without a single weapon, without an army, without even a decent pair of shoes most of the time. From Churchill's defiance, loud, thundering, backed by the full might of the British Empire, to something completely different. A quiet defiance, a gentle one, the kind that's somehow even more dangerous. Rule 5. Your possessions should fit in one hand. When Mahatma Gandhi died, when 3 bullets tore through the chest of arguably the most influential person of the 20th century, the police collected his personal belongings. All of them. Do you want to know what fit in that inventory? A pair of spectacles, a pair of sandals, a pocket watch, a few, maybe 6 or so personal effects, his entire worldly estate, everything this man owned on the face of the earth, fewer than 10 items. Now think about that for a moment. Think about your own life. Think about the stuff. The closet's full of clothes you haven't worn in 3 years. The garage you can't park in because it's full of what? Boxes? Old equipment? Things you bought because some algorithm told you they'd make you happier? Gandhi owned fewer than 10 things. and he changed the world. But I'm not here to make you feel guilty about your stuff. Well, maybe a little guilty, but mostly I'm here to tell you a story. Let me take you back, way back, to the salt. See, by 1930, Gandhi had been fighting for Indian independence for most of his adult life, really. He'd been arrested, he'd been beaten, he'd organized strikes and boycotts and protests of every imaginable kind. And the British Empire, which, let's remember, was the most powerful political entity on the planet at that time, the British Empire just kept sitting there, immovable, like a boulder in a river. Gandhi needed something new, something that would capture the world's attention in a way that speeches and petitions and even prison couldn't. Something simple enough for everyone to understand, but radical enough to shake the foundations of imperial power. And he chose salt. Salt. The most basic, most necessary, most humble substance in any kitchen. The British had a monopoly on salt production and sale in India, which meant that every single Indian person, every grandmother making dinner, every farmer preserving food, every mother feeding her children, had to buy their salt from the British government at whatever price the British government decided to charge. And they had to pay a tax on it too. It was, when you really think about it, breathtakingly cruel. Taxing salt. Taxing the thing that makes food edible. The thing your body literally cannot survive without. So, on March 12th, 1930, Gandhi started walking. He walked from his ashram in Sabarmati to the coastal town of Dandi, 240 miles. It took, I believe it was 24 days, 24 days of walking in the Indian heat at 60 years old, with thin legs and bad knees, and those iconic sandals that couldn't have had much arch support. And here's the genius of it. Here's what made Gandhi Gandhi. He told everyone exactly what he was going to do. He wrote to the British Viceroy, Lord Irwin, and said, essentially, I am going to walk to the sea, pick up a handful of salt, and break your law. He told them, in advance, gave them every opportunity to stop him or arrest him or negotiate. They didn't take him seriously. People kept making that mistake with Gandhi. You'd think they'd have learned. By the time he reached Dandi, thousands of people were walking with him. The world's press was covering it. And when he bent down on that beach on April 6th, 1930, and picked up a small lump of natural salt from the mud, he broke the law. And in doing so, he broke something much bigger. He broke the myth that the British Empire was invincible. Because what do you do when a 60-year-old man in a loincloth picks up some salt? Shoot him? Beat him? The whole world is watching. There's no proportionate response. There's no dignified way to enforce a salt tax against a man who is clearly, obviously, undeniably standing on the side of basic human decency. That's non-violent resistance. That's the weapon Gandhi invented. Well, he didn't invent it exactly, but he perfected it in a way nobody had before. You make the oppressor's violence visible. You force them to choose between backing down and revealing themselves as monsters, and either way, you win. Now, I want to fast forward through some years here, because this isn't a history lecture, and you're trying to fall asleep. But I need you to understand the context of Gandhi's last days, because without it, his death is just a tragedy. With it, his death is a lesson. By January 1948, India had been independent for about 5 months. 5 months since the British finally packed up and left. You'd think Gandhi would have been celebrating, right? The great victory, the impossible dream realized. He was in despair, because independence had come with partition, the splitting of British India into 2 separate nations, India and Pakistan, Hindu and Muslim, and the process of partition had been, I don't have a word for it. Catastrophic doesn't cover it. Horrific doesn't cover it. Between 1 and 2 million people died. In the violence that accompanied partition. Hindus killing Muslims, Muslims killing Hindus. Sikhs caught in the middle. Entire villages burned. Trains arriving at stations full of corpses. Refugees, maybe 15 million of them, streaming across borders with whatever they could carry, losing everything they'd ever known. Gandhi had spent his life preaching Hindu-Muslim unity. Unity. The idea that these were not 2 peoples but one. And now they were slaughtering each other in numbers that defied comprehension. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He fasted. On January 13th, 1948, Gandhi began a fast unto death. Not a hunger strike, not a symbolic gesture, a fast unto death. He would not eat again until Hindu and Muslim leaders in Delhi came together and pledged to stop the violence. He was 78 years old. He'd been fasting periodically for decades, and his body was already frail. His doctors told him, in terms I imagine were rather urgent, that at his age, a prolonged fast could kill him very quickly. Gandhi's response, more or less, was, yes, that's rather the point. See, this is what people miss about nonviolent resistance. They think it's passive. They think it's gentle. They think it's the easy option, the path for people who are too scared or too weak to fight. It is the opposite of that. Non-violent resistance requires you to be willing to die for your principles while refusing to kill for them. Read that again. Willing to die. Refusing to kill. That's not weakness. That's a kind of strength that most of us, myself included, honestly, can barely imagine. The fast lasted 5 days. 6 days actually, ending on January 18th. Leaders from all the major religious communities came to Gandhi and signed a pledge for peace. He broke his fast with a sip of orange juice. 12 days later, he was dead. January 30th, 1948. A Friday, late afternoon. Gandhi was walking through the garden of Birla House in New Delhi, heading to his evening prayer meeting. He was late. He was almost always late, which is a charming detail for the father of an entire nation. And he was leaning on the shoulders of 2 young women, his grandnieces, who helped support him because he was still weak from the fast. The garden was crowded. People pressed forward to touch his feet, which was a traditional sign of respect in Indian culture. Gandhi smiled. He pressed his palms together in greeting, Namaste. A man stepped forward from the crowd. Nathuram Godse, 37 years old, a Hindu nationalist who believed Gandhi had been too accommodating to Muslims, too willing to give things away, too soft. Godse bowed, and then he pulled out a pistol and fired 3 shots into Gandhi's chest at point-blank range. Gandhi fell, and as he fell, and this is the part that I think about late at night, the part that I can never quite get past. As he fell, his hands came together in a gesture of prayer or forgiveness or greeting, and he said 2 words. Hiram! Oh God! That's it. Those were his last words. The man who had moved millions, who had brought an empire to its knees with nothing but moral authority and a willingness to suffer, who had spent decades crafting some of the most powerful statements in the history of political thought. His last utterance was a simple invocation, a prayer. 2 syllables. He-ram. The bullets had hit his chest and abdomen. He died within minutes, right there in the garden, among the flowers and the prayer mats and the people who loved him. He was 78 years old. The news spread across India like a shockwave. And then something remarkable happened. Something that I think Gandhi himself would have found deeply significant. There were no riots. In a country that had been tearing itself apart for months, in a nation where communal violence had become almost routine, the response to Gandhi's assassination was silence, grief, mourning, but not violence, not retaliation. It was as if, in dying, Gandhi had finally demonstrated the power of his message so completely, so undeniably, that even the people gripped by hatred paused. Well, not everywhere. There were scattered incidents. I don't want to romanticize it, but the feared nationwide explosion of retaliatory violence simply didn't happen. Not on the scale anyone expected. The funeral took place the next day. 2 million people, some estimates say more, but let's be conservative, lined the 5-mile route through Delhi. The procession took 5 hours. Fighter planes flew overhead dropping rose petals, and at the cremation site on the banks of the Yamuna River, as the funeral pyre was lit, a nation wept. Now, let me come back to those possessions. Fewer than 10 items. When you tallied up everything Gandhi owned on the day he died, it could practically fit in your cupped hands. His spectacles, his sandals, his pocket watch, which he tied to his waist with a piece of string because the strap had broken and he never bothered to replace it. That detail always gets me. The father of Indian independence walking around with a watch held on by string. A few books, a small eating bowl, some writing materials. That's it. That's everything. And I know, someone listening to this is thinking, well, that's easy for Gandhi. He was an ascetic. He chose poverty. That's not realistic for normal people. And you're right. I'm not suggesting you sell everything you own and start wearing a dhoti. That would be impractical and probably quite cold, depending on where you live. But here's the thing Gandhi understood that most of us don't. We don't own our possessions. Our possessions own us. Everything you buy is a tiny anchor, a small weight tied to your ankle. And 1 anchor is fine. 10 anchors are fine, but eventually you've got so many anchors that you can't move, can't change, can't grow. You're stuck exactly where you are, surrounded by stuff that was supposed to make your life better, but somehow made it smaller. Gandhi moved freely. He could go anywhere, do anything, respond to any crisis, because he had nothing to protect. Nothing to lose. No house to worry about, no car to insure, no wardrobe to maintain. His possessions fit in one hand, and so his other hand was always free. Free to reach out, free to help, free to hold someone else's. When you're dying, and we're all dying, slowly, every single day, that's not morbid, that's just biology. When you're dying, you don't reach for your stuff. You reach for people. Gandhi knew this his whole life. Most of us don't figure it out until the end. So here's the rule. Your possessions should fit in one hand. Not literally. Again, please don't sell your house because a sleepy old man on a podcast told you to. But the grip they have on you, the mental and emotional space they take up, should be small enough that you've still got room for what matters. People. Purpose. Prayer. Whatever your version of he ram turns out to be. And maybe fix your watch strap. Gandhi could get away with string. You probably can't. All right. From Gandhi, who gave up everything, who owned almost nothing, who died with his hands pressed together in prayer. To someone very, very different. A man who had fame, fortune, a musical legacy that will probably outlast most civilizations on this planet. A man who, in his final moment, with his last breath, looked at his own son and said the 5 words that every billionaire, every CEO, every person who has ever chased money hoping it would save them, needs tattooed on the inside of their eyelids. Rule 6. Money can't buy life. His last words to his son Ziggy were 5 words that billionaires still haven't figured out. 5 words. That's all it took to summarize everything Bob Marley had learned in 36 years of living. And he packed more living into 36 years than most people manage in 90. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I keep doing that. It's a bad habit. Bear with me. Let me take you to Kingston, Jamaica. December 3rd, 1976. 2 days before the Smile Jamaica concert. A free outdoor show that Marley had agreed to perform to try to ease the violent political tensions that were tearing his country apart. Now, you need to understand. Jamaica in 1976 was essentially a war zone with a tourism brochure. The 2 main political parties, Michael Manley's People's National Party and Edward Seager's Jamaica Labour Party, were locked in a conflict that went well beyond normal politics. Their supporters were armed. Neighbourhoods were divided along party lines. People were dying in the streets. And Bob Marley, who had deliberately tried to stay above politics, who saw himself as a voice for unity rather than division, agreed to do this concert. Free. Open to everyone. Come together. One love. All of that. Not as a campaign event, not as a political rally, but as a musical ceasefire. Somebody didn't like that idea. 2 days before the concert, 7 armed men walked into Bob Marley's house at 56 Hope Road. And yes, the street was really called Hope Road, because apparently God has a sense of irony, and opened fire. Marley was hit in the arm and chest. His wife, Rita, was shot in the head. She survived. The bullet somehow traveled between her scalp and skull without penetrating, which is either a medical miracle or proof that Rita Marley was tougher than all of us combined. His manager, Don Taylor, was hit 5 times, standing right in front of Bob, essentially shielding him with his own body. Now, here's where this story becomes a Bob Marley story. Any reasonable person, having been shot, would cancel the concert, right? That's not even debatable. You got shot. You are actively bleeding from bullet wounds. Nobody would blame you for staying in bed, taking your medication, and letting someone else worry about national unity for a while. Marley played the concert. 2 days later, arm in a sling, bullet still lodged near, I think it was near his elbow, stood up on that stage in front of 80,000 people and performed for 90 minutes. When someone asked him why would you play a concert after being shot? He said something that I think about almost every day. He said, "The people who are trying to make this world worse are not taking a day off. How can I?" Let that settle. Really let it settle in. The people who are trying to make this world worse are not taking a day off. How can I? That's not bravery in the way we usually understand it. That's not the chest-thumping, flag-waving, look how tough I am kind of courage. That's something else. That's a man who understood that his music wasn't entertainment. It was medicine, and you don't stop dispensing medicine because someone tries to burn down the pharmacy. Now I need to talk about the music for a minute. Because Bob Marley's music wasn't just good, it wasn't just catchy melodies and nice vibes and something pleasant to play at beach parties, though it was all of those things too. His music was philosophy set to a beat. Take Redemption Song, the last song on the last album he completed while he was still healthy enough to record. Listen to the lyrics sometime. Really listen, not as background music, but actively. He's singing about mental slavery, about the chains we put on our own minds, about emancipating yourself from the prisons you've built inside your own head. And one love. Everyone knows One Love. It's been used in commercials and wedding receptions and, look, it's been commercialized to within an inch of its life. I won't deny that. But strip all of that away. Go back to the original recording. What's he actually saying? He's saying that love is not a feeling. Love is a decision, a practice, a discipline. One love, one heart. It's a demand, not a suggestion. He's telling you that you don't get to choose who deserves love and who doesn't. You love everyone or you love no one. There's no middle ground. From a man who got shot for trying to bring people together. That's not naive optimism. That's battle-tested faith. But here's where the story takes a turn that, well, it haunts me. Sometime in 1977, the exact timeline gets a bit fuzzy. Marley injured his right toe playing football. Soccer, for the Americans listening. He was an avid player, played nearly every day, and during a match, he hurt his toe. These things happen. You stub a toe, it hurts, it heals, you move on. Except this toe didn't heal. The nail came off. The wound kept not closing. Eventually, reluctantly, because Bob Marley was the kind of person who would rather just keep playing football than go see a doctor, he had it examined. Melanoma. Acral melanoma, specifically, which is a type of skin cancer that occurs under the nails or on the soles of the feet. It's actually more common in people with darker skin, which is something a lot of people don't know. And in 1977, the prognosis for metastatic melanoma was not good. The doctors told him, and I want you to imagine this conversation because it must have been surreal. The doctors told one of the most famous musicians on the planet that they needed to amputate his toe, maybe more than the toe. They needed to cut it away before the cancer spread. Marley refused. Now this is where the story gets complicated, and I want to be fair about it. His refusal wasn't just stubbornness or denial, though there may have been elements of both. Marley was a devout Rastafarian, and Rastafarian belief holds the body as a temple, whole and sacred. Amputation was, in his understanding of his faith, a violation of that wholeness. The body had to remain intact. Some people have criticized this decision. Easy to criticize from the outside, from decades later, from a position of not being the one facing the choice, but faith doesn't always lead where medicine recommends. And Marley's faith wasn't casual. It wasn't a hobby. It was the foundation of everything. His music, his worldview, his identity. Asking him to amputate his toe wasn't just asking him to remove a body part. It was asking him to betray the spiritual framework that had sustained him through poverty, through violence, through everything. He did agree to a lesser procedure. They removed the nail bed and did a skin graft, I believe. But the full amputation? No, he couldn't. The cancer, of course, didn't care about theology. It spread. Slowly at first, then not slowly. But Marley kept touring, kept performing, kept making music. In 1979, he released Survival. In 1980, Uprising, which contained Redemption Song and Could You Be Loved, and some of the most powerful work of his career. He knew he was sick. He knew the cancer was advancing. And he played anyway, because the people trying to make the world worse weren't taking a day off. The last concert, September 23rd, 1980, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Uprising Tour. Marley was visibly unwell. He'd lost weight. His energy, that boundless, electric, almost supernatural energy that had defined his performances for 2 decades, was dimming. During the show, or actually shortly before it, I should be careful about the sequence here, he nearly collapsed. He played anyway, got through the concert, but everyone who was there, everyone in his inner circle knew this was the end of something. 2 days later, or thereabouts, Marley collapsed while jogging in Central Park in New York City. He was taken to the hospital, and the news was what everyone feared. The cancer had spread to his brain, his lungs, his liver. It was everywhere. What followed was a desperate attempt to find treatment. Conventional medicine in the US offered little hope. The cancer was too advanced, too widespread. So Marley traveled to Germany, to the clinic of a controversial doctor named Joseph Issels, who practiced unconventional cancer therapies. Marley spent months there, undergoing treatments that were, well, let's say the medical establishment had strong opinions about their validity. But Marley believed. He wanted to fight. He always wanted to fight, just not with weapons. The treatment didn't work. By May 1981, it was clear that nothing was going to work. Marley wanted to go home. Not to Germany, not to a hospital, not to some sterile room with machines and tubes. Home, Jamaica. He wanted to die in Jamaica, He almost made it. The flight from Germany went through Miami, and by the time the plane landed, Marley was too sick to continue. He was taken to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Miami, and it was there, on May 11th, 1981, that the story ended. But not before those 5 words. His son Ziggy was at his bedside. Ziggy Marley, who was 12 years old at the time, 12, try to hold that in your mind, was sitting with his dying father. And Bob looked at his boy and said, "Money can't buy life." Money can't buy life. 5 words that demolish an entire civilization's operating assumptions. 5 words that every person who has ever sacrificed their health for a paycheck, their relationships for a promotion, their life for a lifestyle, needs to sit with in the quiet hours of the night. Bob Marley had money. He wasn't fabulously wealthy by modern standards, but he was successful, internationally famous, could have had almost anything he wanted. And at the end, lying in a Miami hospital room with the Jamaican sun on the wrong side of the window, he told his 12-year-old son the one thing he wanted him to carry forward. You can't buy more time. You can't purchase another heartbeat. All the money in the world, stacked to the ceiling, piled in vaults, invested in portfolios, it can't add a single second to your life when the clock runs out. He was 36 years old. 36. Now, there's one more piece of this story that I think matters enormously, and it often gets overlooked. In the final months of his life, Bob Marley, the Lion of Rastafari, the man who had embodied that movement for millions of people around the world, was baptized into the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He took the name Beheni Selassie, meaning Light of the Trinity. Some Rastafarians were upset by this. Some saw it as a betrayal, a deathbed conversion driven by fear rather than faith. But I think the truth is simpler and more beautiful than that. Marley wasn't abandoning anything. He was expanding. At the very end, facing the mystery of what comes after, he reached for more understanding, not less. More God, not less. He didn't shrink. He grew. And isn't that what we want at the end? Not to narrow down, not to collapse into fear and certainty and rigid definitions of who we are and what we believe, but to open up, to become larger somehow, even as the body becomes smaller. Money can't buy life, but maybe faith can expand it, even at the very end, especially at the very end. The funeral was held on May the 21st, 1981, in Kingston, a state funeral for a man who'd never held political office, never commanded an army, never run a country. He'd just made music, that's all. He'd just stood on stages and sung songs about love and justice and freedom and unity. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough to change the world. The Ethiopian Orthodox rite was performed alongside Rastafarian customs. He was a man of great spirituality, said the Prime Minister. But that doesn't quite cover it. He was a man who believed, truly, genuinely, in his bones believed, that music could heal, that one love wasn't a lyric but a strategy, that the people trying to make the world worse don't take days off, and so neither could he. So here's the rule. And it's the simplest one yet. Money can't buy life. Not one breath. Not one sunrise. Not one more conversation with your 12-year-old son. What are you spending your life currency on? Because you're spending it right now. Every second, the meter is running. Every hour, the account is draining, and you can't earn it back. Can't refinance it. Can't get a loan against tomorrow. And before you ask, no, I don't have a financial advisor recommendation. I'm a storytelling grandpa, not a wealth manager. But if I were a wealth manager, my first piece of advice would be, spend less money and more time. The returns are better. All right. Deep breath. Take a moment. Let those settle. Churchill and his black dog, Gandhi and his salt and his sandals, Marley and his music and his 5 last words. We've talked about resilience, about simplicity, about the things money can and can't buy. But now I want to take you somewhere different, somewhere much, much older. 2,400 years older, to be precise. Because the next person on our list didn't fight the darkness like Churchill, didn't resist the empire like Gandhi, didn't rage against mortality like Marley. Instead, he did something that I think is even harder than any of those things. He welcomed death like an old friend, poured it a drink, sat down across the table from it, and had a conversation. From Marley's rebellion, loud, musical burning with righteous fire, to the calmest, most deliberate death in recorded history. From Marley's rebellion, loud, musical burning with righteous fire, to the calmest, most deliberate death in recorded history. His name was Socrates, and he died the way he lived, asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Now, picture Athens in 400 BC. Not the marble ruins you've seen in photographs. Picture it alive, crowded, loud, smelling of fish and olive oil and ambition. The marketplace, the agora, is where everything happens. Commerce, gossip, politics, philosophy. It's the center of the known world's greatest city. And wandering through it every single day is the strangest man anyone has ever seen. He's ugly. Not charmingly ugly. Genuinely, remarkably ugly. Bulging eyes. A flat, broad nose that people compared to his face openly where he could hear, to a satyr's. Short, heavy-set. He goes barefoot even in winter, because shoes, he says, are unnecessary. He wears the same rough cloak for years. He has no money, no property, no job in any formal sense. His wife, Xanthippe, is famously frustrated with him. His children are essentially raised by a woman whose husband wanders the marketplace all day, talking to strangers. And yet, Athens cannot look away, because Socrates has a gift, a devastating gift. He can talk to anyone. Generals, senators, poets, craftsmen, wealthy merchants, and within 20 minutes he has them completely tangled. Not because he's mean, not because he's cruel, but because he asks the most reasonable questions in the world. And somehow those reasonable questions reveal that the person being questioned doesn't actually know what they think they know. He called himself a gadfly, a horsefly, small, annoying, impossible to ignore. Athens, he said, was a great horse, powerful, noble, but growing sluggish. And he had been sent, by the gods, he believed, by the oracle at Delphi specifically, to sting it back to life. Can you imagine? Being that uncle at Thanksgiving? the one who won't let anyone get away with saying something stupid, except he did it for a living, every day, in public, with a smile, and they eventually killed him for it. But here's the thing about Socrates that most people miss. He wasn't being difficult for sport. He genuinely believed, with his whole strange, ugly, barefooted soul, that the unexamined life was not worth living. That most of us walk through our days like sleepwalkers, confident we know what justice is, what courage is, what virtue is, and we've never once stopped to check. He was the check. Therefore, because he was so good at his job, because he was so relentless, because he had made so many powerful people look foolish in front of so many people, Athens finally had enough. In 399 BC, 3 Athenian citizens brought charges: Miletus, Anytus, Lycon. The official charges: impiety toward the gods and corrupting the youth of Athens. The real charge, the one nobody wrote down, was something closer to making important people look stupid, repeatedly, in public, with witnesses. The trial draws 500 jurors. 500. This is democracy, Athenian style, mob democracy, direct democracy, with all its glorious messiness. And here's where Socrates, being Socrates, makes everything worse. He could apologize. He could beg, he could be humble and contrite, and promise to stop wandering the agora, asking his terrible questions. Other men in his position had done exactly that. It worked. You humble yourself, the jury feels magnanimous, you go home. But Socrates gives what historians politely call a provocative defense. He tells the jury they should be thanking him. He tells them he is doing Athens a service. He compares himself again to a gadfly sent by God, and implies, not subtly, that if they kill him, they're killing something sacred. He then says, and I need you to hear this because it's extraordinary, he says that the appropriate penalty for his so-called crimes would be free meals for life at the Prytaneum, the dining hall where Olympic athletes are honored. The jury had been split. 280 voted guilty. 220 voted innocent. A swing of 30 votes, 30 people out of 500, would have saved his life. But then he gave that speech, and the jurors who voted to acquit him, some of them voted for the death penalty out of sheer outrage. He turned his own supporters against him. He received the Hemlock. Now here's something the history books often skip. Socrates wasn't executed immediately. He had to wait. Every year, Athens sent a sacred ship, a religious vessel, on a pilgrimage to the island of Delos. This was in honor of Theseus, the great hero who had sailed to Delos and back. And by ancient law, no execution could be carried out while the holy ship was at sea. No blood could be spilled while Athens was in a state of sacred observance. The ship had set sail the day before his verdict. So Socrates waited 30 days, in prison with visitors continuing to talk, continuing to think, continuing to be Socrates, which is to say, continuing to ask questions about life and death and what it means to do either well. And during those 30 days, his friends panicked. His closest friend, Crito, came to him in the early morning hours while the guards slept. He had a plan. The money had been arranged. The guards had been spoken to. A boat was waiting. Socrates could be in Thessaly by dawn, somewhere outside Athenian jurisdiction free. But Socrates refused. He would not flee, not because he was afraid, not because he was tired, but because fleeing would mean he had lied. His entire life had been built on the idea that you must obey just laws and challenge unjust ones through argument, not by sneaking away in the dark. If he ran now, everything he had ever taught would become hollow. He would prove his accusers right. He would prove that when things got hard, Socrates cared about Socrates. "Crito," he said, "what will people say?" Not what he meant. What he meant was, what will I have been? If I run now, what was any of it worth? Therefore, he stayed. Plato, who wrote almost everything we know about Socrates, was not in the room when his teacher died. He was ill that day. What we have comes from a man named Phaedo, who was present, whose account Plato later wrote down in one of the most extraordinary documents in human history. The Phaedo, a dialogue about the immortality of the soul, narrated on the very day of the Hemlock. The scene Phaedo describes is almost impossible. The prison guard comes in weeping himself, because he has to deliver the cup. He tells Socrates he's the finest, gentlest, best man he has ever escorted to death. He asks Socrates not to blame him. He leaves the room crying. Socrates' friends, Phaedo, Crito, others, are weeping openly, sobbing, and Socrates scolds them. He says, "What is this? I sent the women away for exactly this reason. This is not how a philosopher meets death. Be quiet, compose yourselves." He drinks the hemlock without ceremony, calmly, as if it's wine. Then he walks, up and down the cell, because the jailer told him movement slows it slightly. He walks until his legs begin to feel heavy. Then he lies down. The numbness travels upward, feet, shins, knees, thighs. A jailer presses his foot, asks if he can feel it. Socrates says no, presses his leg. Nothing. The coldness reaches his waist. And then, in the final moments, Socrates stirs, and he says something. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay it and do not neglect it." That was it. Those were his last words. And for 2,400 years, people have been arguing about what they mean. Asclepius was the god of medicine and healing. In ancient Greece, when you recovered from an illness, you sacrificed a rooster to Asclepius in gratitude. It was the thank you for being cured. So why does a dying man mention a debt to the god of healing? Some scholars say he literally owed someone a rooster and didn't want the debt unpaid. Honor to the end. Even the small debts matter. But most who've sat with this long enough, believe something else. Something that once you hear it, you cannot unhear. Socrates believed his whole life that the soul was imprisoned in the body. That birth was not a beginning, but a kind of illness. The soul trapped in flesh, struggling to see clearly, struggling to know true things, limited by the senses, muddied by appetite and fear and desire. And death. Death was the cure. Death was graduation. Death was the moment the soul finally got to see clearly. So, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. We owe a thank you for the cure. Life was the sickness. Death was the medicine. And Socrates, even as the hemlock stopped his heart, was grateful. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Socrates would not let you be comfortable. That was not his gift. His gift was discomfort. Precise, surgical, loving discomfort. The kind that wakes you up. So here's what he would ask you, right now, today. Wherever you're sitting, whatever you're worried about, whatever you're putting off, he would look at you with those bulging eyes and that flat nose and that patient, slightly devastating smile, and he would say, "What do you believe in?" Not what you say you believe in. What you actually, demonstrably live as if you believe. What is justice to you? Not the word, the thing. What would you sacrifice for it? What is courage? Have you tested it? How do you know? What are you actually afraid of? Not the thing you call fear. The thing underneath it, the thing fear is protecting. He would pick up your phone and ask, "What is this for?" And not what you tell yourself it's for. What it's actually for. What it actually does to your days, your attention, your ability to be present. He would ask, "Is the examined version of this life better than the unexamined one? Are you even looking?" You are not obligated to come up with good answers. Socrates didn't provide answers. He asked questions. He believed the asking was the point, that a mind genuinely grappling with hard questions is already more alive than a mind that has decided the questions don't apply to it. A life unexamined is not worth living. A death unexamined is not worth fearing. And remember, that rooster, hold on to it, because when we meet our final philosopher tonight, the man who wrote about death the way other men write love letters, that rooster is going to make a completely new kind of sense. Socrates drank poison and called it medicine. Our next story is about a woman who held medicine in her hands every single day of her adult life, who discovered the invisible forces that heal, forces that burn through tumor and bone, forces that would eventually transform surgery and save millions of lives, who worked with those forces in a leaky shed, by lamplight, with no protection for decades. And it killed her. But she knew. She had to have known, and she kept going anyway. There is a room in Paris, a reading room at the Bibliothèque Nationale, where they keep her notebooks, not copies, the originals, the ones she wrote in herself, in her own hand, in French and Polish, while she was making the discoveries that would change the world. You cannot hold them. They are stored in lead-lined boxes, because after more than a century, they are still radioactive, still emitting radiation so consistently that if you want to examine them, you must sign a liability waiver. You must wear protective equipment. You are being warned formally that proximity to her handwriting is hazardous. Her cookbooks are radioactive, her furniture, her clothes. She will be dangerous for another 1,500 years. Her name was Marie Curie, and she is the only person in history to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, physics and chemistry. The only woman to win 2, the first woman ever to win 1. She paid for every syllable of that achievement with her body. She was born Maria Sklodowska, November 7th, 1867, in Warsaw. Russian-occupied Warsaw, which matters enormously, because the Russians had banned Polish women from higher education. Banned them entirely. If you were female and Polish and you wanted to learn, the university doors were locked. But Warsaw had a secret. It was called the Floating University, or the Flying University. An underground network of women who gathered in private apartments, rotating locations to avoid detection, teaching each other mathematics and natural science, and literature and history, the things they were officially forbidden to know. Young Maria attended. Conspiratorial, illegal, extraordinary. She made a deal with her sister Bronya. Maria would work, as a governess, as a tutor, and send money to Bronya in Paris so Bronya could complete her medical degree. When Bronya finished, Bronya would support Maria in return. Maria worked for 6 years, sent every spare franc, watched other people's children while her own mind starved. Then she got on a train to Paris. She was 24 years old. She enrolled at the Sorbonne as Marie, Frenchifying her name. She found a tiny garret apartment she could barely afford, which she heated with a spirit lamp, wearing all her clothes at once in the winter because she had spent her fuel money on books. She sometimes fainted in her lectures from hunger. From hunger because she had spent her food money on books. She finished first in her physics degree. Then she came back and finished first in mathematics. And then she met Pierre. Pierre Curie was already a respected physicist when they met. He'd done significant work on crystals and magnetism. Their introduction was arranged by a mutual acquaintance, and their courtship, such as it was, consisted almost entirely of conversations about science, about physics, about the nature of magnetism and matter, and what the universe was made of. It was, by any measure, the most productive flirtation in the history of science. They married in 1895. No church, no wedding gown. Marie wore a dark blue suit she'd chosen because it was practical enough to wear in the laboratory afterward. Which she did. Their laboratory was a leaky shed. This is not a metaphor. The medical school of Paris had offered them a shed. An old dissecting room, really, that leaked when it rained and had inadequate ventilation. They took it. They boiled enormous quantities of pitch blende, a heavy dark ore, in a cast iron pot, stirring it with an iron rod for hours, breathing the fumes, no masks, no gloves, no protective equipment of any kind, because nobody yet understood what radioactivity was, what it did, that invisible particles were passing through their skin and their lungs and their bones with every breath. In that shed, over 4 years, Marie processed literally tons of pitch blende. Tons. The ore had to be boiled down, filtered, concentrated, refined, over and over, to extract the tiny quantities of new elements hiding inside. And in the dark, the shed glowed. Blue, a soft, beautiful, eerie blue. Their flasks of radium and polonium, because she discovered 2 elements, not one, glowed in the darkness like something from a fairy tale. Marie loved it. She wrote about sitting in the dark, watching the glow, finding it beautiful. She kept test tubes of radioactive material in her pockets, on her desk, on her bedside table. She was being irradiated continuously, steadily for years, decades. But here is what she found. Polonium, named for Poland, the country she was forbidden to study in, the country she could never quite stop carrying. Radium, which would transform medicine and cancer treatment and give the world X-ray technology that still saves lives today. 2 Nobel Prizes. 1903, Physics, shared with Pierre and Henri Becquerel. 1911, Chemistry, hers alone. When the Nobel Committee informed her of the first prize, Pierre was the one they notified first. She was his assistant in their minds. He corrected them. He refused to accept without her. But in April 1906, Pierre Curie walked across a busy Paris street in the rain, distracted, lost in thought probably, the way scientists get, and stepped in front of a horse-drawn cart. The wheel passed over his head. He was 46 years old. Marie learned by a knock on her door. She did not make a public scene. She did not collapse, at least not where anyone could see. She went inside, and she stayed inside for a long time. And then she came out, and she went to the Sorbonne, where Pierre had been a professor, and she took over his lectures. His last lecture had ended mid-sentence. She began her first lecture with the next sentence. She continued exactly where he had left off. She became the first female professor in the history of the Sorbonne. Therefore, because grief had nowhere to go except forward. Here is the part of Marie Curie's story that gets left out of the schoolbooks. In 1911, the same year as her second Nobel, a French newspaper published claims that she was having an affair with a married physicist named Paul Langevin. Langevin was a former student of Pierre's. He and Marie were close, had grown closer after Pierre's death. The French press, and then the international press, went absolutely feral. They called her a home wrecker. They called her a foreign Jew. She was neither. They called her a danger to French family values. There were crowds outside her building, shouting. She had to hide her daughters with friends. The Nobel Committee, the same Nobel Committee that was, at that very moment, preparing to give her a second Nobel Prize, wrote to suggest she perhaps not attend the ceremony. Given the circumstances, given appearances. She wrote back, "I'm coming." She got on a train and travelled to Stockholm and accepted her prize and gave her speech, her second Nobel Prize in chemistry. Her hands were so damaged by radiation by then that she had difficulty with buttons. She was 44 years old. She had been publicly humiliated across 2 continents. She was collecting her second Nobel Prize, and she was slowly dying from the work that earned it. When the First World War came, Marie Curie did not sit it out. She built mobile X-ray units, small radiology labs fitted into vans, and drove them to the front lines herself. They called them Petite Curies. She trained over 150 women to operate X-ray equipment at field hospitals. It is estimated that over 1 million soldiers were X-rayed using the equipment she designed and deployed. France never formally recognized her war service. She never patented radium. Never. She believed that scientific discoveries belonged to the world. That to patent her process would be to wall off something that was fundamentally humanities. She gave the knowledge away, freely, to every laboratory and hospital that asked. She then couldn't afford to buy enough radium for her own research. She spent her last years visibly ill, fingers burned and scarred from decades of radiation exposure, cataracts in both eyes from radiation, fatigue so profound that she could barely work, aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow was failing, poisoned by the particles she'd spent a lifetime with. She died on July 4th, 1934. She was 66. The coffin had to be lined with an inch of lead. Her body was too radioactive for a normal burial. She was reinterred in the Pantheon in Paris in 1995, 61 years after her death. The first woman interred there on her own merit. Pierre was moved to be beside her, and her notebooks sit in their lead-lined boxes, still ticking with invisible energy, still dangerous, still somehow hers. There's a version of Marie Curie's story where she's a tragic figure, where the lesson is, be careful, protect yourself. Don't burn yourself up in the pursuit of something that won't protect you back. But I don't think that's what she'd say. She refused painkillers at the end. There are accounts, debated, uncertain, of her last words being, "I don't want it," turning away from the morphine, and other accounts that say she was asking about an experiment, about her work. Even then, even at the end, maybe both things are true. See, the question Marie Curie's life asks you is not, was it worth it? That's too easy. That's a question with a calculable answer. Of course, it cost more than it gave her personally, if we're keeping score. The question is, what are you actually pursuing? And are you honest about what it costs? She was not naive. She was not reckless. She was making a choice every single day to keep going. The work was worth the cost to her. Not because she didn't value her life. She raised 2 daughters. She mourned Pierre with an intensity that never really left her. But because she believed in her bones that the thing she was doing mattered more than her comfort, maybe even more than her survival. Is what you're working on worth what it's costing you? Not what you say you're working on. The actual thing. The one that pulls you back to the desk at night. The one you can't quite leave alone. The one that glows a little when the room goes dark. If it glows when the room goes dark, Marie would say yes, it's worth it. But know the price. She knew the price. She just decided to pay it anyway. And there is something hard to name that is not tragic about that. Something that is almost exactly the opposite of tragic. She chose the glow, from a woman who predicted the future of science with her hands and her body and her life, to a man who predicted the date of his own death. And he did it with a joke. He said, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it. It would be the greatest disappointment of my life if I didn't go out with Halley's Comet." Halley's Comet reached its closest point to the Sun, perihelion, on April 20th, 1910. Mark Twain died on April 21st, 1910. He was right. Of course he was right. He was always right. He was just usually right about things that made you laugh before you realized he was also being serious. That was the whole trick. That was the whole life. Samuel Langhorne Clemens was born on November 30th, 1835, in the small Missouri town of Florida, 30 miles from the Mississippi River that would define him. 2 weeks after his birth, Halley's Comet blazed across the sky. His mother noticed. He would remember it, or at least claim to, and either way, the story belongs to him now. He grew up on the river, worked as a riverboat pilot, which was then one of the most skilled and prestigious professions in America. You had to memorize hundreds of miles of shifting channels, sandbanks, underwater hazards in both directions, in every season, in fog and darkness and storm. One of the calls a riverboat pilot made to measure depth was Mark Twain, meaning 2 fathoms, 12 feet, safe water. Safe to proceed, safe to keep going. He chose it as his pen name. He published The Innocents Abroad and became famous. He published Tom Sawyer and became more famous. He published Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, arguably the great American novel, the one that Ernest Hemingway said all of American literature comes from, and became the most famous American writer alive, possibly the most famous American full stop. He lectured. He performed. He was devastating on stage. He had that hair, that moustache, those white suits. He had a voice. Not just a literal voice, though that was remarkable, that slow Missouri drawl that could deliver a punchline like a man dropping a piano from a window, but a voice in the truest sense. A way of seeing the world, puncturing its pretensions, loving its people, and mourning, underneath it all, things too painful to say plainly. He was the most beloved man in America. And he was, for a significant portion of his adult life, quietly, comprehensively devastated. Let me tell you about the losses, because you can't understand Twain. The late Twain, the Twain who said the secret source of humor itself is not joy but sorrow, without understanding what he lost. First, his brother Henry. Samuel had gotten Henry a job on a riverboat. His own boat, the Pennsylvania, and Henry's boat were traveling one behind the other, and Samuel had been removed from the Pennsylvania following an altercation with the pilot, and therefore was on a different boat when the Pennsylvania's boiler exploded near Memphis in 1858. Henry was on the Pennsylvania. The explosion killed over 150 people. Henry was pulled from the water alive, survived for several days in agony, and then died. Possibly, accounts differ, from an overdose of morphine given by a well-meaning but inexperienced doctor. Samuel was there for those last days. He saw Henry go. He had recommended Henry for the job. He carried that for the rest of his life. 62 more years. He carried it. But there was more. He married Olivia Langdon in 1870. Livy, he called her. She was gentle and smart, and she genuinely saw him, the whole of him, including the darkness, and she loved what she saw. They had 4 children. Langdon, who died as an infant. Susie, Clara, Jean, Susie. Susie was, by all accounts, by the accounts of everyone who knew her, luminous, brilliant. She was writing a biography of her father at 13. She was the one most like him, most alive to language and ideas and the vast comedy and tragedy of being a person. He adored her absolutely. In 1896, while Twain was on a lecture tour in England, he was on the road to pay off debts from a catastrophic business investment. Susie developed meningitis. The illness progressed quickly. By the time word reached him across the Atlantic, she was already gone. She was 24 years old. He didn't get to say goodbye. He didn't get to hold her hand. She died in the house where she had grown up, in Hartford, delirious with fever, and among her last sensate acts was touching the wall of her childhood bedroom and recognizing the wallpaper. He never went back to Hartford, could not bear it. Scholars mark Susie's death as the turning point. Before Susie, Twain the satirist, Twain the entertainer, Twain the warm American voice. After Susie, something harder, colder, funnier, sometimes. But the humor had an edge now that could draw blood. The man that corrupted Hadleyburg. What is man? His late notebooks are full of passages that would alarm you if you didn't know their context. and even knowing their context, they alarm you. Livy died in 1904, in Italy, where they'd gone for her health. And then Jean, his youngest, had epilepsy. She had been diagnosed young, treated variously, lived with it for decades. She had come to live with him in his last years, as a kind of secretary, as a companion. He was in his 70s by then, white-haired, white-suited, slowing. On Christmas Eve, 1909, Jean went to the bathroom to take her morning bath. She had a seizure. She drowned in the tub. Samuel Clemens found his daughter. He sat down and he wrote an essay called The Death of Jean. He wrote it in 4 hours, essentially without stopping. It is among the most unbearable and beautiful things he ever produced. He describes finding her. He describes the stillness of the house. He describes what grief feels like at the cellular level, when the body knows before the mind does. And then, this is the part. At the end of the essay, he writes that he is glad that she had been suffering for so long, that her epilepsy had been such a long imprisonment, that death, coming quickly, coming cleanly in a cold bath on Christmas morning, had, in its own terrible way, been a mercy. He was trying to find the mercy, even then, even there. He was turning it in his hands, looking for the angle where the light caught it right. He never wrote again, not substantially, not the big things. The death of Jean was essentially his last act. The white suits, the cigars. Here is something I need you to know about Mark Twain. He smoked, by various estimates, between 22 and 40 cigars a day. Every day. He smoked in bed. He smoked at his desk. He smoked at dinner. He smoked on trains. He is one of the most thoroughly documented cigar smokers in American history. His doctors told him to stop. I have made it a rule, he said, never to smoke when asleep, and never to refrain when awake. On his deathbed, near the very end, when he was too weak to hold a cigar, too weak to speak clearly, he pantomimed smoking. He made the gesture, the motion, as if the hand remembered even when the body had forgotten how to participate. I don't know if that's stubbornness or love or just pure, irreducible Twainness. Maybe all three. The white suits were also a late decision. He began wearing them in his 70s, at a time when white flannel was for summer only. It was simply not done to wear white year-round, particularly in the grey months. He wore them anyway, everywhere. Congress, formal dinners, Oxford University, where they gave him an honorary degree. He was asked about it. He always had an answer. He said the dark clothes everyone wore looked like they were already in mourning, like they were pre-grieving, and he was not going to shuffle toward the end in dark clothes as if he'd already given up. He was going out bright. He was going out visible. He went out visible. April 20th, 1910. Halley's comet reaches perihelion, its closest approach to the sun, blazing across the sky visible to the naked eye. April 21st, 1910. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, age 74, dies of a heart attack at his home in Redding, Connecticut. Halley's comet is still in the sky. He had been predicting this for years. Not grimly, gleefully. He told the prediction to friends, to reporters, to anyone who would sit still long enough. It delighted him. The comet and him, twins of a kind, born together, gone together, bookending a life with celestial punctuation. And the most extraordinary thing is that he was right. He was right. You could say coincidence, you could say lots of people die every day, and the comet happens to have been there. You could say he was dying anyway. He was 74. The math wasn't complicated. All of that is true. And none of it matters. What matters is that he reached for the comet as a frame, as a way of putting his death inside a story big enough to hold it. He was a writer to the last breath. He refused to let his death be a mere fact. He made it a sentence, a perfect, final, well-constructed sentence, with the comet as the period. Now, I told you this was going to be the funniest section, and I owe you that. He was genuinely hilarious. The man was genuinely, catastrophically, breathtakingly funny, in a way that almost nobody has matched before or since. But here's what I didn't tell you yet. The humor got darker. With each loss, the humor sharpened into something that could genuinely wound you. Late Twain is not the man who wrote Tom Sawyer sneaking out to go fishing. Late Twain wrote things like, "The secret source of humor itself is not joy but sorrow. There is no humor in heaven." He said, "I have been complimented many times, and they always embarrass me. I always feel that they have not said enough." He said of death, "I do not fear death. I had been dead for billions and billions of years before I was born, and had not suffered the slightest inconvenience from it." He said, and this one requires a moment, "I came in with Halley's Comet, and I expect to go out with it. The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together. Freaks." He called himself a freak, with genuine affection, with the full understanding that being a freak, being the person who says the true thing that everyone else is pretending they can't see, is the only honest way to move through a world this strange. His obituary, written by someone who had known him, said, "They say among themselves that he died of a broken heart." Not his heart, a broken heart. The distinction matters. The losses broke something that the humor could paper over, that the white suits could paper over, that the cigars and the lectures and the honorary degrees could paper over. But underneath it all, Twain was a man who had loved enormously and lost catastrophically, more times than any human being should reasonably have to absorb. And he absorbed it. He kept absorbing it. He turned it into words and performances and essays and prophecies and jokes, always the jokes, because that was the only alchemical process he trusted. Grief into laughter, darkness into light, broken heart into, if not a fixed heart, then at least a productive one. Twain would not tell you to be strong. He would not give you a speech about resilience or gratitude or the importance of looking on the bright side. He had been told by life itself every conceivable version of the lesson about impermanence, and he respected you too much to hand you a platitude when he knew you had your own version of the lesson coming. What he'd do is tell you a joke. Not a cheerful joke. Not a joke designed to make you feel better in the way that implies your pain is something to be patched over. A dark joke. A true joke. The kind that names the exact terrible thing, holds it up to the light, points out its absurdity. Because everything, including the worst things, has some absurdity in it if you look long enough, and makes you laugh before you can stop yourself. And in that laugh, in the half-second before you catch yourself, you'd feel the weight shift. Not lift. It doesn't lift, but shift. Move slightly, the way a too heavy pack adjusts on your shoulder when you change your grip. That's what he'd give you. Not answers, not comfort. The permission to find it funny. The insistence, actually, not permission, insistence, that finding it funny is not a betrayal of the pain, but a way of surviving it with your humanity intact. He smoked 40 cigars a day and pantomimed smoking when he couldn't hold them anymore. He wore white suits when everyone said it wasn't done. He predicted his death by a comet and then showed up for the prediction. He was trying every single day of his life to be present for the extraordinary absurdity of being alive. Even when, especially when, being alive was costing him everything. Humor is not the opposite of seriousness. Humor is the highest form of it. If you can laugh at death, really laugh. Not nervously, not defensively, but with genuine recognition, then you have already looked it in the face. You've already done the thing most people spend their whole lives running from. Twain ran toward it, in white flannel, with a cigar. From a man who predicted his death by the stars, to a man who saw his death in a dream, 3 days before it happened, and told his wife about it, and then went to the theatre anyway. Lincoln never got to predict his ending. He didn't get to frame it, or light it, or deliver it on his own terms the way Twain did. It came for him in the dark, in a theatre, in the middle of a laugh. Because that's when it always comes, isn't it? In the middle of the laugh, the good moment, the thing you thought would last a little longer. But what he said before that moment, what he believed, what he carried, what he whispered to his wife in the box at Ford's Theatre, in the hours before the bullet found him. That's another story. Let me tell you about a man who was sad. Not the polite kind of sadness, not the kind you dress up and take to dinner parties. Abraham Lincoln was sad the way a river is wet, all the way through in every direction with no dry place left to stand. His friends confiscated his razors. They did. They hid the knives because they were afraid of what he might do with them in his darker hours. This was not a rumor. This was the 16th President of the United States. He lost his mother when he was 9. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, dead of milk sickness, a disease caused by drinking milk from cows who had eaten white snake root. He watched her die. He helped build her coffin. And then he lived with the grief of it for the rest of his life, which turned out to be a very long time to carry something that heavy. Then he lost Anne Rutledge, the woman many historians believe was his first real love. She died of typhoid fever in 1835. Lincoln was 26 years old. He told a friend afterward, "I can never be reconciled to have the snow, the sleet, and storms beat on her grave." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He meant it. He couldn't bear the thought of rain touching the ground above her. Then he lost Eddie, his son, 3 years old. Then Willie, 11 years old, dying in the White House itself in 1862 in the middle of the war, Mary Todd Lincoln never recovered. She held seances in the White House trying to speak to Willie's ghost. Lincoln, who was holding the Union together with both hands, was also holding a grieving wife together with both hands. At the same time, for years. And through all of this, people mocked him. They called him an ape, a baboon, a tyrant. Cartoonists drew him as a monster. Newspapers called him unfit, ugly, incompetent. When someone accused him of being two-faced, he looked down at his angular, battered face and said, "Perfectly, without missing a beat. If I had two faces, would I be wearing this one?" That's Lincoln, the sadness and the wit inseparable. But here's what the sadness made of him. See, most people think Lincoln was great, despite his suffering. I think he was great because of it. He had been acquainted with loss so intimately for so long that he understood suffering at a molecular level. He knew what it felt like to be broken. And therefore, he couldn't bring himself to break others. When his generals wanted to shoot deserters, scared young men who had run from battle, Lincoln pardoned them. Over and over. He visited wounded soldiers in hospitals, Union and Confederate alike. He would sit at the bedside of a dying Confederate boy, hold the boy's hand and weep. Not because he agreed with what the boy had fought for, but because the boy was dying, and Lincoln knew what dying looked like. This is why he was the right man for the Civil War, not because he was fearless. He wasn't. Not because he was strong. He could barely hold himself together on some nights. He was the right man because he was sad. Because he had earned, through decades of personal loss, a quality that cannot be taught, a supernatural empathy, an inability to see an enemy as anything other than a suffering human being. That quality is what the war needed, and no one else had it. Now, April 1865. The war is ending. Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. And Lincoln, who had been gaunt and haunted for 4 years, who had aged 20 years in 5, was happier than anyone had seen him in recent memory. Visibly happier. He told Mary Todd Lincoln something in those last days that stopped me when I first read it. He said, "We must both be more cheerful in the future. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable. We must both be more cheerful." He was planning it. The after. The thing that came next. A road trip out west. A visit to the Holy Land. A life after the thing that had nearly consumed him. He was reaching for it. He could almost touch it. But first, there had been a dream. Days before April 14th, Lincoln woke from a dream that disturbed him deeply. He described it to his cabinet, to Mary, to anyone who would listen. In the dream, he wandered through the White House and heard weeping. Awful, inconsolable weeping from somewhere in the building. He followed the sound from room to room until he reached the East Room. And there, lying on a catafalque, a funeral platform, was a corpse in funeral dress, surrounded by soldiers. Lincoln asked one of the soldiers, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier said, "The President. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln told this story and then sort of dismissed it. Dreams, he said, just dreams. And maybe he believed that. Or maybe he had carried death long enough to know that you don't outrun it by refusing to look at it. April 14th, 1865. Good Friday. Lincoln spent the morning in good spirits. He attended a cabinet meeting where he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd had a dream again. A familiar dream, actually, one he'd had before battles throughout the war. Something about a ship moving swiftly toward a dark and indefinite shore. He always had that dream before something significant happened. He told his cabinet this, and then they moved on to other business. That afternoon, Lincoln asked his bodyguard, William Crook, to accompany him on a walk. At the end of the walk, Lincoln said goodbye. Not good night, goodbye. Crook noted it immediately. In 4 years of service, Lincoln had always said good night at the end of the day. Always. This was the first and only time he said goodbye. Crook thought about it all the way home. That night. Ford's Theatre. Our American cousin. Lincoln's regular bodyguard, John Parker, was assigned to stand outside the presidential box and guard the door. Parker decided, and I want you to really sit with this. Parker decided to go watch the play. And then, during intermission, he left the theatre entirely to go have a drink at the tavern next door. The same tavern where John Wilkes Booth was drinking. Parker left his post. The door to the presidential box was unguarded, and Booth knew exactly which door it was because he had been to this theatre many times before. He knew the floor plan. He had planned this for weeks. Lincoln's last words were to Mary. She had leaned close to him in the box. They were holding hands, which people noted because it was unusual for a president to show such public affection. And she whispered something about what the other people in the theatre might think of them. And Lincoln, who had spent 4 years in the ugliest crisis in American history, who had lost children and friends and nearly his mind, who had been called every terrible name a man can be called, leaned close to his wife and said softly, "She won't think anything about it." Booth's derringer fired half a second later. Lincoln never regained consciousness. They carried him across the street to the Peterson house, a boarding house. He was too tall for the bed, 6'4". They laid him diagonally across the mattress, his great long legs at an angle, and there he lay, through the night, while a stunned nation stood in the rain outside and wept. Dr. Charles Leal was the first physician to reach Lincoln's side. He was 23 years old. He examined the wound and understood immediately that it was fatal. Nothing could be done. But Leale did something that, when I first read it, I had to put the book down for a moment. He took Lincoln's hand, and he held it all night. For 9 hours, as Lincoln's breathing slowed, as the room filled with cabinet members and generals and doctors and grief. Young Dr. Leal held the president's hand. He wrote later that he did it so that Lincoln would know, even in unconsciousness, that he was in touch with humanity and had a friend. That phrase, in touch with humanity, and had a friend. Lincoln died at 7:22 in the morning on April 15th, 1865. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at the bedside and said, and historians still argue about whether it was ages or angels, because the witnesses couldn't agree, and I think that uncertainty is somehow perfect. He said now he belongs to the ages, or the angels, either way. Now, I want to tell you something about Lincoln's wallet. When they went through his pockets after he died, they found the things you might expect: a watch fob, a pocket knife, a small purse. But they also found newspaper clippings, folded carefully, carried close to his body. And when they unfolded them, they discovered that the man who had been called an ape and a baboon and a tyrant for 4 solid years had been walking around with the rare newspaper editorials that said something kind about him, that praised him, that called him good. He had kept them. He had carried them. This man, who faced down the dissolution of a nation, who lost children, who was surrounded by death and accusation and cruelty, needed kind words the same way the rest of us do. He was just honest enough to admit it, at least to himself, in his pockets where no one could see. Tonight, tell someone what they mean to you. Don't wait. Lincoln's wallet tells us something that no speech ever could, that even the greatest among us are hungry for a kind word. Even the ones who look like they've got it figured out. Even the ones who seem unmovable. They're carrying clippings in their pockets, hoping someone noticed that they did good. Tell someone they did good. Lincoln dreamed his death and walked toward it anyway. Not with bravado, not with a performance of courage. He walked toward it with gentleness, choosing cheerfulness, holding Mary's hand, saying goodbye to his bodyguard, planning the trip west they would never take. The premonition didn't make a coward of him. It made him kind, and maybe that is the bravest thing a person can do when the end is near. Turn toward the people beside you and say, simply, warmly, without any drama, she won't think anything about it. Lincoln dreamed his death and walked toward it anyway. Our next story is about a man who didn't dream his death. He lived it. He stood before a firing squad, heard the drums, and in the seconds before the bullets came, everything changed, because the bullets never came. Russia. 1849. 28 years old. A young writer, already recognized, already celebrated. The poor folk had been read aloud to a literary circle and caused grown men to weep. He was brilliant. He knew it. And he was doing what brilliant young men have always done, gathering with other brilliant young men to argue about books and politics and the future of the world. The Petroshevsky Circle, a group of intellectuals meeting in St. Petersburg apartments to discuss utopian socialism, to read forbidden texts, to imagine a Russia different from the one Tsar Nicholas I was running with an iron fist in an iron glove. Were they dangerous? By modern standards, not particularly. By the standards of Nicholas I, catastrophically so. They were arrested, tried in secret, sentenced. December 22, 1849. Semyonov Square. Snow on the ground. Dostoevsky and 20 other men were marched out in white execution shirts, the traditional garment for condemned prisoners, and arranged before a firing squad. Drums rolled. A priest came forward and read the sentence. The first 3 prisoners were led to the stakes and bound, blindfolds placed over their eyes. Dostoevsky was in the second group. He had, by his own calculation, approximately 60 seconds to live. Now, what do you do with 60 seconds? He divided the time, methodically, almost calmly. He would spend some of it saying goodbye to his friends standing beside him. Some of it thinking about life, what it had been, what it had meant, and the final part, just looking at the world one last time, the square, the snow, the sky, and there, above the rooftops, the gold dome of a church catching the winter sunlight. He wrote later that in that moment, the light on that dome became the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. The most beautiful thing he had ever seen. After 28 years of eyes that had looked at countless things, that dome in that moment was everything. A messenger arrived. The execution halted. A document was read. The Tsar, who had, it emerged, pardoned them the day before, had orchestrated this entire morning as a psychological lesson, a warning, a demonstration of imperial power that stopped just short of imperial murder. The sentence was commuted. Dostoevsky would serve 4 years of hard labor in Siberia instead of dying in a square in St. Petersburg. One of the men who had been tied to the stakes, a man named Grigoriev, who had stood blindfolded, believing he was about to be shot, went permanently and irreversibly insane. The experience shattered something in him that never came back together. Dostoevsky walked away, changed but not broken. Something in him had been reorganized. That same day, he wrote to his brother Mikhail. The letter still exists. You can read it. And what he wrote, hours after standing before a firing squad, was this: Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Every minute can be an eternity of happiness. Every minute can be an eternity of happiness. Not irony, not coping. He meant it. The man who had just watched the light on a church dome become the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen had understood something that most people spend their entire lives circling around without ever landing on. Then came Siberia. 4 years, hard labor, hands and feet shackled, sleeping in a barracks with 80 other prisoners, heat in summer, cold in winter, that you cannot imagine if you haven't stood in it. The guards called the prisoners the dead. Because, in a sense, they were. But on the day Dostoevsky arrived, something happened. A group of Decembrist wives, women who had followed their revolutionary husbands to Siberia decades earlier, who had grown old there, who had become their own small civilization of dignified suffering, came to meet him. They pressed something into his hands. A New Testament, the only book allowed in the prison, and inside the pages, hidden in the binding, they had tucked money. He carried that book for 4 years. He had no pen, no paper, but he had fingernails, and he made marks, tiny notations, underlines, marks in the margins, on 527 of the book's 620 pages, 1,413 separate marks, counted by scholars later, every one of them a conversation with the text, in the only language he had available. He entered that prison a secular intellectual who had read about religion the way one reads about geography, with interest but without investment. He emerged a man for whom faith was as real and essential as breathing. He called it his regeneration, not metaphorically, Something had died in Semyonov Square, and something else had grown in its place, slowly, in the cold over 4 years, by lamplight, with a fingernail and a book. And therefore, because of the mock execution, because of Siberia, because of the regeneration, he wrote the novels. Not before, after. Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, The Brothers Karamazov, everything that would make him immortal, everything that would cause readers in every language for the next 2 centuries to feel profoundly understood by a dead Russian man, that all came from the man who had looked at a church dome and known it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Now, I have to tell you something about Dostoevsky's gambling problem, because he was a complicated man, and I want you to understand him fully. He was not a saint. He was not a simple convert. He was the same Dostoevsky who had diagnosed with surgical precision the deepest sickness in the human soul. The capacity for self-destruction, for cruelty, for the murder of fathers, for the betrayal of love. And then he would go to the casino and lose his rent money, pawn his wife's wedding ring, write desperate letters begging for loans. He could diagnose the deepest sickness of the human soul, and then lose his rent money at the casino, which, honestly, might be the most human thing in this entire video. He proposed to Anna Snitkina, who would become his great love, his anchor, the woman who managed his life and transcribed his novels and made it possible for him to function, by pretending he was describing the plot of a novel he was writing. He said, "The main character, a man older than you might expect with many flaws, has fallen in love with a young woman. What do you think she should say?" And Anna, who understood exactly what was happening, said she thought the young woman would say yes. February 1881. Dostoevsky is 59 years old. He has been having hemorrhages. His body is failing, the emphysema advancing, the years of hard labor having left their long, slow damage. On the morning of February 9th, he woke and told Anna, "I know that I shall die today." Not a guess, not an anxiety. A fact stated calmly. He asked for a candle, and he asked for the New Testament, the same one from 1849, the one from the Decembrist wives, the one with 1,413 fingernail marks in it, the book that had travelled with him for 31 years. Anna read to him, Matthew chapter 3, and then he said to her, "And I want you to hear this slowly, because it is one of the most beautiful things a dying man has ever said to the woman he loves." He said, "Remember this, Anya. I always loved you passionately and was never unfaithful to you, even in my thoughts, even in my thoughts." He asked Anna to read the parable of the prodigal son, the son who squandered his inheritance and lived among pigs and came home in rags, expecting nothing, and was met by a father who ran toward him, who threw a robe around his shoulders, who said he was lost and is found. He spoke to his children. He said, "Have absolute faith in God and never despair of his pardon." He died at 8:38 that evening. Romans 8:38. Neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God. His daughter Lyubov wrote later, "I have been present at many deathbeds, but none was so radiant as that of my father. 30,000 people came to his funeral, 30,000. In 1881. When there was no internet, no announcement, no organized gathering, just word of mouth spreading through a city that understood it had lost something irreplaceable. Anna never remarried. She outlived him by 37 years. When she was in her 70s, she wrote, "I still belong only to him in every thought." Every thought. 37 years. Earlier tonight, I told you about a teenage girl in an attic who faced the same darkness and was not given the reprieve Dostoevsky was given. Anne Frank faced the firing squad in her way, and the bullets came. Dostoevsky got the miracle she didn't, and he spent the rest of his life, every hemorrhage, every gambling debt, every epileptic seizure and ecstatic second of it, trying to be worthy of that miracle, trying to use the borrowed time well. He mostly succeeded. And where he failed, he wrote about the failure with such honesty that we recognized ourselves in it. That's its own kind of success. Here is what I want you to take from Dostoevsky's story, and I want you to take it seriously. You have already survived your firing squad. Whatever it was for you, the diagnosis, the divorce, the accident, the phone call in the middle of the night, the moment you sat in a parking lot unable to drive home because your hands were shaking too hard, you survived it. You're here. You're listening to an old man's voice in the dark, which means you made it. Everything from this point forward is the bonus round. Every day is the bonus round. And some of us, most of us, forget that by Tuesday. Dostoevsky learned to live because he was forced to rehearse his death. Our final story tonight is about a man who wasn't forced at all. He chose to rehearse it every single day for decades, and when the order finally came, he was ready. Here is the thing about time. You think you don't have enough of it. You have said this, I know you have. I don't have time. It is possibly the sentence you say most frequently across the whole of your life. I don't have time for that. I don't have time for this. Time is the scarce thing, the precious thing, the thing that is always running out. But a man died in Rome almost 2,000 years ago who wrote something I need you to hear. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we squander a great deal of it. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and he believed, deeply philosophically with rigorous and unrelenting intellectual force, that you have too much time, not too little, too much. And the tragedy is not that it runs out. The tragedy is what you do with it while you have it. Let me tell you his story, and then I will tell you why this video was called what it was called. Seneca was born in Cordoba, in what is now Spain, somewhere around 4 BC. Give or take, the Romans were not meticulous about birth records. He was brought to Rome young, educated brilliantly, and became one of the great writers and thinkers of the ancient world. A Stoic, a playwright, an essayist, a man whose letters to his friend Lucilius are, I would argue, among the most readable philosophical texts ever written, because Seneca wrote not for posterity, not to sound wise, but because he was genuinely working out how to live a good life and wanted Lucilius to benefit from the work. But Seneca was complicated. Beautifully, frustratingly, irreducibly complicated. He preached simplicity. He wrote movingly about the prison of wealth, the way possessions possess us, the freedom of needing little. He wrote, "Nothing is ours except time." He believed this. He also had a net worth estimated by historians at the equivalent of roughly $150 million in modern money. He owned multiple villas. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. His critics, and he had many, pointed this out loudly and often, with a particular Roman flavor of delight. Was Seneca a hypocrite, or was he a man who understood his own weakness so clearly that he wrote about virtue because he needed to be reminded of it? I think the second. I think the letters to Lucilius are less a professor's lecture and more a man's desperate notes to himself, shared because he knew he wasn't the only one who needed them. He preached detachment from power. He served as the primary tutor and advisor to Nero, arguably the most catastrophically insane emperor Rome ever produced, and the competition for that title is genuinely fierce. For a period called the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years, Seneca guided Nero towards something resembling wisdom. Those 5 years are the best argument for Seneca's actual influence. And then Nero descended. He murdered his own mother. He kicked his pregnant wife to death. He performed in public as a musician and forced senators to applaud. He rebuilt Rome to his personal specifications after a fire. Some whispered he had started himself. The man Seneca had spent years trying to shape into a philosopher king became something else entirely. Seneca tried to retire. He offered Nero all of his wealth, everything, in exchange for permission to step back. Nero declined. The money stayed. The obligation stayed. The connection to the monster stayed. And Seneca stayed too, writing his letters, working out his philosophy, knowing that something was coming and that he could not outrun it. In AD 65, a conspiracy formed. 41 senators and soldiers and various Romans who had simply had enough of Nero, calling themselves the Pisonian Conspiracy after their nominal leader, Gaius Calpurnius Piso. The plan? Assassinate Nero, install Piso as emperor. Some of the conspirators, it was whispered, wanted Seneca as emperor instead. The conspiracy was discovered. The arrests began. The confessions, extracted in the Roman fashion, which was not gentle, cascaded. Seneca's name came up. Maybe he was involved. Maybe he wasn't. With Nero, it didn't matter much. The suspicion was enough. Nero sent a tribune to deliver the verdict. The tribune's name was Gavius Silvanus. And here, in a detail that feels like something Seneca himself might have written into a play, because it is so exactly what should happen. Here is the thing. Gavius Silvanus was himself a secret member of the conspiracy. He had signed on to kill Nero. And now Nero was sending him to deliver Seneca's death sentence. Silvanus carried the message. He couldn't bring himself to deliver it in person. He sent a centurion instead. The centurion arrived at Seneca's villa. Seneca was at supper with his wife Paulina and 2 friends. The sentence was read, calmly. He asked his friends to stop weeping. He said, "Where are the precepts of philosophy? Where the preparation of so many years against evils to come?" He said this gently, not harshly. The way a teacher speaks to students who have studied for the test and are now, at the moment of the test, forgetting everything. He had been preparing for this moment his entire adult life. He had rehearsed it. Every day, in his letters, in his philosophy, he had turned to face death and said, "When you come, I will be ready." Now, the moment was here, and he was ready. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and also one of the most prolonged deaths in recorded history, and I want to walk you through it because it matters. Seneca cut the veins in his wrists. But he was old, 60-something, possibly 70, and years of chronic illness and ascetic living had left him thin and poorly circulated. The blood flowed too slowly. The cut was not going to do the work he needed it to do. Not quickly, not mercifully. His wife, Paulina, who loved him the way Anna loved Dostoevsky, with that total fidelity that is its own kind of philosophy, stepped forward and cut her own wrists. She intended to die with him. Seneca, seeing her pain, told her she had chosen well, but he didn't want her to suffer. He asked his attendants to carry her to another room and bandage her wounds. She survived. Nero's soldiers made sure of it, not from compassion, but to avoid the outrage of killing a woman alongside her husband. Paulina lived on, pale for the rest of her life from the blood she had lost. Every person who saw her face after that day saw the mark of what she had been willing to do. Seneca cut the arteries behind his knees, still too slow. The old body refused to cooperate with the plan. He called for Hemlock. And here, I need you to pause with me for a moment here, because this is deliberate. Seneca knew his classical history better than almost anyone alive. He knew that Socrates had died by Hemlock in Athens 464 years before this moment. He had written about Socrates. He had invoked Socrates as the model of the philosophical life, the philosopher who died as he had lived, calmly talking, surrounded by friends, making the thing of dying into the final lesson. Remember the rooster? Remember Socrates asking Crito to pay the debt to Asclepius, the god of healing, because death was the cure? Seneca chose Hemlock. On purpose. He was saying, I am in that tradition. I am ending this the way he ended it. Not from arrogance, from devotion, from a love of philosophy that extended to dying philosophically. But the Hemlock didn't work either. His circulation was too weak to carry the poison quickly through his body. He was carried into a warm bath. The heat expanded his blood vessels, accelerated what was happening. He was dying now, finally, and he knew it. And what did he do? He dictated. He was dying, slowly, with tremendous physical difficulty, over the course of hours. And he was dictating his philosophy. His students and secretaries were in the room, taking it down. Those writings, whatever he said in those last hours with the water and the steam and the dying, those writings have been lost. We don't know what he said. The record breaks off. But he said something. He was still teaching, still working, still trying to put into words the thing that life had been, right up until the breath stopped. He sprinkled water on the slaves attending him and said, I make this libation to Jupiter, the liberator. Jupiter the Liberator, the god you invoke when you are freed from slavery. He was not fleeing death. He was not being punished by it. He was being freed by it. That's the Stoic position, held all the way to the end. Socrates had his Rooster for Asclepius, the cure for the disease of living. Seneca had his libation to Jupiter, freedom from the chains of the body. 464 years apart, the same truth spoken in different words. He had specified in his will, no elaborate funeral, no ceremony, no spectacle. Cremation, quietly. He had written this when even in the midst of his wealth and power, he gave thought to his life's close. He had been thinking about the end for decades. He had known it was coming. We all know it is coming. And instead of flinching away from the knowledge, he had sat with it, learned from it, let it clarify everything. Now, let me tell you what Seneca actually believed, not as a historical curiosity, as something that matters to you, tonight in the dark, wherever you are listening. He wrote, "Life is long, if only you knew how to use it. Long, not short, long, if you use it." He wrote, "Putting things off is the biggest waste of life. It snatches away each day as it comes and denies us the present by promising the future." Does that land? Do you feel that? He wrote, "Nothing is ours except time." He wrote, "He who has learned to die has unlearned slavery." And he wrote the one that became his most famous, the one that hangs over this entire video like a lantern. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we squander a great deal of it. This is the thesis. This is what tonight has been building toward. Every story, every one of these 12 extraordinary lives has been circling this. Let me show you what I mean. Viktor Frankl, in a Nazi concentration camp, had every reason to spend his time on bitterness. He spent it on meaning instead. He did not waste it. Lawrence Oates, walking out into the blizzard, had every reason to cling to his remaining minutes. He spent them in service of others. He didn't defer. Anne Frank, in an attic in Amsterdam, had every reason to put her diary down. She kept writing. She used the time. Churchill, told his career was finished, painted, wrote, prepared, never stopped. He filled every moment. Gandhi stripped his possessions to nothing. Not from poverty, from choice. He travelled light because he had somewhere to be. Marley played through the pain, never waited for better conditions. The music couldn't wait. Socrates spent his life on the only thing that mattered. Truth. Not 1 hour squandered on something small. Marie Curie let her work outlive her. She knew the cost and paid it anyway. The glow was worth it. Mark Twain turned grief into art instead of letting it consume him. He alchemized the darkness. Lincoln, knowing the end was near, chose gentleness, chose kindness, held Mary's hand, used those final hours on love. Dostoevsky, standing before the firing squad, divided the time precisely, every remaining second assigned. Every day after that, the bonus round, treated with the reverence it deserved. And Seneca, who had been saying it for decades, who had built a philosophy out of it, who had tried and failed and tried again to actually live what he wrote. Seneca faced his death and made it the final lesson. a libation to the liberator. Words dictated into the steam, philosophy held to the very last breath. The thumbnail of this video says, "You have too much time." I know you read that and thought it was a provocation, maybe a joke, maybe this old man Huxley being clever again. It is not a joke. You have too much time to spend another decade in a career that makes you feel hollow. Too much time to keep not calling the person you've been meaning to call. Too much time to defer the project, the conversation, the apology, the trip, the painting, the book, the moment of simply sitting down and being present with the people you love. You have too much of it left, enough certainly to make different choices, to waste another morning on whatever small distraction kept you from the thing that actually matters. This is not a taunt. It is liberation. Seneca's liberation. The kind that comes in warm water, surrounded by friends when you have spent your whole life preparing for exactly this moment. The problem has never been the shortness of life. The problem is the length of distraction. The fire is lower now. I want to sit with you for a moment before I let you go. Just a moment. The kind you might steal at the end of a long evening with people you love, when everyone else has gone to bed and you're left in the quiet, and you think, "Oh, that was good. That was really good." Tonight you spent time with 12 people. You sat with Viktor Frankl in a concentration camp and watched him choose meaning over despair. You stood at the edge of a blizzard with Lawrence Oates and heard him say, almost quietly, that he may be some time. You looked over Anne Frank's shoulder as she pressed her pen to paper in an attic in Amsterdam and wrote, against all evidence that people are good at heart. You walked with Churchill through the wilderness years, painting landscapes while the world ignored him. You sat cross-legged with Gandhi on the eve of the march that would change everything. You felt the stage vibrate under Bob Marley's feet as he played through the pain, because the music couldn't wait and neither could the people who came to hear it. You watched Socrates refuse the escape and pour the hemlock himself. You stood in Marie Curie's laboratory as she chose the work over the warning. You laughed, despite everything, at Mark Twain, who understood that the darkness is funnier than it thinks it is. You held Lincoln's hand in the dark of the Peterson house, the way young Dr. Leal held it, so that he would know he had a friend. You watched the light change on a church dome through Dostoevsky's eyes in his final 60 seconds, before the miracle came, and he got to carry that light forward for 30 more years. And you listened to Seneca dictate his philosophy into the steam of a warm bath in Rome in the year 65, until there was nothing left to say, and then nothing left. 12 lives, 12 different shapes of courage. And underneath all of them, I believe this, I have always believed this, the same simple truth spoken in 12 different languages. The time is now. The time has always been now. It was now in Auschwitz and in the Antarctic and in an Amsterdam attic. It was now in the cabinet war rooms and on the Dandy beach and on a Jamaican stage. It was now in an Athenian prison and in a Paris laboratory and in a Missouri chair where an old man with white hair was turning his grief into a sentence. It was now in a theatre box in Washington and in Semyonov Square and in a Roman bath. It is now here, with you, in the dark. You are not someone who fears death. You are someone who has spent this night with 12 of the greatest human beings who ever lived, and they have given you the secret. Not the secret to living forever. There is no such secret, and if there were, I'm not sure we'd want it. The secret to living now. To looking at the ordinary moments, the light on a dome, the hand in yours, the page under your pen, the music in your chest, and recognizing them for what they actually are. Everything. They are everything. Find meaning in the suffering, the way Frankl did. Have the courage to let go, the way Oates did. Keep creating in the dark, the way Anne Frank did. Never stop building, the way Churchill did. Travel light, the way Gandhi did. Play through the pain, the way Marley did. Ask the real questions, the way Socrates did. Let your work outlive you, the way Curie did. Laugh at the darkness, the way Twain did. Be gentle, especially near the end, the way Lincoln was. Treat every day as the bonus round, the way Dostoevsky did. And stop wasting the time you have, the way Seneca would have wanted you to, the way he kept trying to, all his complicated, contradictory, brilliant life. You are going to die someday. So am I. So did every one of them. And in the meantime, there is the light on the dome. There is the hand to hold. There are words to say tonight, to the people who need to hear them, that you have been carrying in your wallet too long. Say them. Do the thing. Make the call. Not tomorrow. Not when the conditions are better. Not when you've figured it all out. Those are the tricks time plays on us when we're not paying attention. Those are the excuses that Seneca was writing about 2,000 years ago, which means they are not new problems and they are not going away on their own. The fire is almost out. The night has been long and rich and full, and I am grateful, genuinely, quietly grateful, that you spent it here. Sleep now. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, nightlings, and wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. This story is done, but yours continues.